potentially broadens the appeal and the ecosystem longer term.
So, Paul, since you said, like, you left Friday, that was
Yes.
the day that all the ETFs started trading, and you're back today. So this is what you missed. In that first week of trading, spot Bitcoin ETFs in the U.S. saw about $6.5 billion in shares change hands. Wow. That's according to Bloomberg Intelligence data. That is much higher than any kind of recorded ETFs pegged to traditional assets. So a lot of people are trading and moving these things around. Chris, do we know who?
Oh, I don't know who. I assume it's largely retail investors. I mean, there has been discussion about the institutional investors, but I think the thing to focus on right now is who's going to participate from a firm perspective. So, for example, Vanguard has said that they're not going to offer these ETFs on their platform, at least not now. Over the weekend, I was playing tennis with a registered investment advisor friend, and he said that his firm is in the process of looking at suitability, investor suitability, before they decide whether or not they're going to offer these ETFs. So I think over time, you're going to see more and more firms open up their platforms to these ETFs.
You know, Chris, before these things even started trading, it seemed like a price war erupted. Everybody's cutting the fees here. What's going on here? I mean, I guess it seems like a Bitcoin's a Bitcoin. How do I differentiate one ETF from the other? Is it just fees?
Well, I think it's fees, but I also think you have to look at the performance of the manager over time and how closely do they track. So if you talk to Mike Novogratz, for example, he'll tell you that his Canadian ETF has the best track record of all the ETFs out there. I can't speak to that. I don't know if it's true, but I think that you have to balance the fees along with the track performance of the manager.
So, okay, aside from that, how many more you think are going to come? So there's 11 right now. We get a lot more, a couple more, because I think the big question everyone has is, like, how many of these guys do you actually need?
Yeah, I've heard that said over and over again, and I think that ultimately we'll probably end up with half a dozen or less. I just don't see the need for 13 Bitcoin ETFs at this point.
So, I guess Bitcoin, there's a lot more to the crypto space than Bitcoin. How about other ETFs for, I don't know, Ethereum or whatever else the kids are trading these days?
Sure. So I know that BlackRock and a couple of others have applied for Ethereum-based ETFs. I don't think that we're going to see anything from the SEC probably until May. But having said that, I think that those ETFs are going to be a much more significant in terms of uphill battle. And the reason I say that is because the SEC has said very staunchly that all cryptos, ex-Bitcoin, are considered securities. Mm-hmm. So these folks that want an Ethereum ETF are going to have to convince the SEC that the underlying Ethereum is not a security and why it should be allowed into an ETF.
Yep, and that is going to be tricky, and so maybe we just stick with what we have and then go down to a little bit less. Can I short this thing? Can I put options on it? Can I do anything? When do you guys think that's going to happen?
So ProShares has already applied to have leveraged and short Bitcoin ETFs.
Because Paul would probably be into that.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah, so that I would imagine that those will be coming. But you can also, trade in the futures market, Bitcoin, right? So go to the CME if you want to play futures and options.
So, Chris, we did get the SEC to approve this, and Gensler, SEC Chairman Gensler, was the deciding vote to the positive. But boy, judging by his tweets, he doesn't really seem like he's a supporter here. I mean, is the SEC spoken? Is this done? Are we never going back to like Gary Gensler coming back and saying, you know what, this really is not what we need here?
Well, I can't speak to what's in Chairman Gensler's head, but what I can tell you is that, I think the SEC did this somewhat reluctantly because their hands were sort of tied by the courts. And I think that the ultimate arbiter of this will be in the court of public opinion. What happens to the price of these Bitcoin and Bitcoin ETFs over time? Is it truly a store of value? Is it something that people will look to in times of uncertainty, like digital gold that's been talked about? Time will tell. And I wish I had that kind of crystal ball.
Yeah, time, and it really depends on what time frame, right? Like, is it going to take 3-6 months to suss out, or a lot longer? But Paul, what I think is interesting too is, if you want to diversify your investment, right, that's the whole idea. Let's diversify, let's do alternative investment. Do you need 10% in Bitcoin or do you need like 1%? Like what, and that's going to make a big difference into the uptake of these guys too, Paul.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of folks are just saying, I want to have some exposure, but a lot of folks are saying, I just don't need it at all because I don't understand it. Chris, I know at Eisner Amper, you kind of look at kind of all things fintech, if you will, blockchain. What's the next big thing that you guys are talking to your clients about? Is it just more crypto, better crypto? What's the next big thing you're looking at?
I think the real opportunity longer term is in the tokenization of real world and traditional assets. Crypto is interesting. It certainly has its place. It's not going away anytime soon. But when we look at the efficiency gains and the ability to fundamentally re-architect the middle and back office functions of a number of financial institutions using tokens, I think that is just going to be a huge, significant opportunity in the future.
So I do my taxes with Eisner Amper, just full disclosure.
Thank you.
Inside, I'm like a 90-year-old person, and I don't want to pay any taxes, and I want to be really super safe with my investments. What is the best sort of way to utilize my money that doesn't involve paying a boatload of taxes? Like, do I want a Bitcoin ETF from that perspective? Do I want to switch from the GBC Trust to the ETF? Like, do I want to do those things?
Well, there's a few reasons why you would want to switch, and this is not investment advice, Alex, please understand that. But what I can tell you is that with the ETF, it's much easier to pay your taxes than if you were to own the Bitcoin directly. If you own the Bitcoin directly, now you have basis tracking and a whole bunch of other things that you need to report to the IRS, as opposed to just getting your statement from your ETF provider at the end of the year.
All right, Chris, thanks so much for joining us here. Chris Broderson, Managing Director, Eisner Amper's Business Advisory Group, talking about the Bitcoin ETFs. And again, I follow James Seyffert.
Yeah, he's just the
and
best,
Eric Balchunas,
honestly.
Bloomberg Intelligence. There are crypto leaders. They have a whole group of folks taking a look at ETFs in general, and they've been all over this Bitcoin ETF, but they're just covering the ETF business. And they've been tracking the flows in and out, and it's been, by their reckoning, a smash hit for the ETFs.
Can I just say, we had somebody from Franklin Templeton on talking about their Bitcoin ETF, and my obnoxious question, considering all the amount of energy it takes to generate a Bitcoin, does that then conflict with your ESG fund?
Yeah.
Oh, no. I think they're
all.
going to go solar was the response or something like
it
that.
is a derivative, right? Like it takes so much energy to mine for Bitcoin that actually is a real problem. Then you have to, there's so much wind energy that you can just use that instead of, someone else turning on their lights.
Well, it's not green
in the
if you're diverting like wind energy or solar into
From my house,
mining.
it's not. No.
So that was your question.
That was more my statement more.
Okay.
And they're like, bye-bye, John Tucker.
Whatever.
Yeah, bye-bye, John Tucker.
But I do think that the uptake and who is going to do it
Yeah.
and why, I think will be really interesting. And I think it's going to take a while for all of that to sort of settle out. You're not going to know that just by the flows, which I think is also interesting. And Bitcoin a little softer today. It's been, though, a really wild ride. All right, coming up, we got world and national news now with Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, Alex and Paul. It is now down to 2 in the Republican presidential race. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has dropped his bid for the 2024 nomination, endorsing Donald Trump ahead of tomorrow night's New Hampshire primary. Nikki Haley is hoping an upset in the Granite State will propel her into her home state of South Carolina next month. New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu tells Bloomberg's Joe Matthew and Kayleigh Lines why he is throwing his support behind Nikki Haley rather than former President Donald Trump.
Imagine if you're the former president. In your own party, you can barely get 50% of the vote. That's why Trump's in trouble, right? So now that you have somebody new on the scene, kind of building that kind of momentum is huge. And the key is that it's a one-on-one race. So if Trump can barely hold 50% or keep him under 50% in a one-on-one race, well, the math says that there's 51% to Nikki Haley, and that's what you need to win a state.
New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu. Bloomberg's Laura Davison is also in New Hampshire, part of our political team, covering tomorrow's first-in-the-nation primary.
The 2 polls that just came out last night were not the best for Haley. She was coming in, roughly, mid to high 30s percentage, and Trump was just at 50 or 51%. And that is the kind of gap that is hard to make up on Election Day with just having strong turnout.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison reporting from New Hampshire. President Biden says he is open to, quote, massive changes in border policy if it means a deal for Ukraine aid. Congressional Republicans have demanded a crackdown on migration in exchange for supporting a $110 billion package, including funding for Ukraine and Israel. Biden's remarks are the most detailed offer he's made publicly to break a months-long standoff over foreign aid and the border. He's expressed confidence the Senate could work out an emerging bipartisan border compromise, perhaps as soon as next week. We are going to continue to watch that for you. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Well, stocks are extending Friday's record close of the major indexes. In the S&P 500, 9 and 11 major industry groups that they're up right now. Real estate in the lead. An earnings season that'll ramp up quick in the week ahead. The first week of S&P 500 earnings reports, they topped expectations. Meantime, Seth Carpenter, the chief global economist at Morgan Stanley, looking for rate cuts from the Fed later rather than sooner.
Our baseline is June, but the market's sort of, in my view, a little bit over its skis, looking for, now a little bit less probability, less than half for March, but still high probability there. We think the data sort of pushed them off until June.
Right now, the S&P 500, 16 points higher. That's up 0.3%. 48.56 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 193 points. NASDAQ 132 points higher. That is up 0.2% right now. The 10-year yield, 4 basis points lower, 4.08%. The 2 right now down 1 basis point. That is at 436. And options traders betting on more gains in the S&P 500. So based on those trades, the implication is for a further 3.3% jump in the S&P 500 based on Friday's close. So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
So I wonder at some point, if it keeps going, are we going to wind up seeing Wall Street already rejigger their forecast for this year?
Right.
Could be.
A couple weeks in, and we're like, actually, maybe 5,100.
Until in the mornings when I come in writing this stuff, until I read Gina Martin Adams and the folks over there.
Yep.
Well, yeah.
She's awesome.
I mean, she was calling the earnings recession before anyone even started talking about it.
Yes,
last summer.
Must read every morning.
Who hired her, I wonder? All right, John
That was
Tucker,
Paul.
thank you so much. We appreciate
Should I pat you on the back, or you want to do it yourself?
He already did it. He's good.
All right, Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well. All right, I just got back from a wonderful trip down to Aruba, and both ways flew the Boeing 737-900ER. Worked like a charm. No problems whatsoever. Okay. All good. It wasn't the MAX, it was the ER. Now I understand that the ER may have some issues here. So I don't know what's going on with our good friends at Boeing. When I think Boeing, I think of American engineering ingenuity. But boy, they've had a tough 4 or 5 years. Siddharth Phillip joins us. He's a deputy team leader for global aviation for Bloomberg News. He's in our Bloomberg studios joining us via Zoom. Sid, thanks so much for joining us here. What's going on with Boeing? I mean, it seems like generations we went without dealing with anything, and now it just seems like there's a lot of issues there from an engineering perspective. What do you think's going on?
Thanks, Paul. So, yeah, there is a lot of scrutiny over Boeing's manufacturing quality, and the latest sort of scrutiny is on the 737-900ER, which is the previous generation of the Boeing 737, which is sort of predates the MAX that was used on the flight on Jan 5th that had that dramatic blowout of the plug door. The reason why they've expanded this probe is basically the 900ER uses the same type of plugs on its emergency exits as the one that failed on the Alaska Airlines flight this month. And that's why the FAA has asked airlines that basically operate this type to do sort of for an additional level of safety, to sort of have a visual inspection of it to make sure it's properly secured.
All right. I had a great flight coming back on my 737-900ER. Plane was great. One problem, a huge problem. Screaming kid. Yeah. Probably 3 or 4 years old enough to know better, and his parents should know better, the entire 5-hour flight.
That's tough.
It was brutal. And I just went to the parents at the end. I was like, what do you guys, is this your first
You did?
time? Oh, totally.
What did they say?
Just as we were leaving, I just said, you got to do better. You got to do better.
Did they say anything?
They were not happy with that.
This is the same Paul
Amazing.
who people in the company here at Bloomberg, when he doesn't like the way they dress,
oh,
he
yeah,
calls them out.
Goes right up to them. You can't wear flip-flops in my place of business.
Well, for sure. I don't want to see your toes. I really don't want to see your toes.
Exactly.
And there has to be
You
a
don't
measurement.
mess with Paul.
Yeah.
And also, like, shirt buttons, you need to not have them low. That's all for guys. Anyway, and for girls. So, back on track. Sid, Boeing made it in to Saturday Night Live over the weekend. When that happens, I feel like that becomes a real issue. Like, it's now in the everyday vernacular. It's in the skit of the weekend. how big a PR problem is this really going to be? Or do we feel like it's already kind of priced in?
I think it is priced in, but I mean, essentially what everyone's looking for in what investors are looking for is basically trying to see how things go from here. Essentially, the MAX 9 is still not back in service, and that's really the key question as to when regulators will approve of the procedure to sort of bring them back into service. And also everyone's looking to see what the deliveries look like and whether or not this will have any impact on deliveries of new planes that are sort of stretch out into next year. Because as you know, I mean, airlines are looking for as much lift as they can, as much capacity as they can. And this is really crucial to determine how this sort of demand goes forward, especially at a time when there's a little bit of uncertainty about how the demand's going to play out. I mean, we've seen revenge travel, and we're looking to see sort of indications of how that's going to play out. I mean, a lot of airlines are going to be reporting earnings in the next couple of days, and we shall see what they really talk about outlook.
So, Sid, I mean, I guess the reality is this is a duopoly. It's Airbus and it's Boeing. I can't just say, I'm fed up with Boeing. I'm going to start buying my stuff from Airbus, because Airbus has got multi-year, backlog. So if you're Boeing, what's job one, do you think? Is it marketing, PR, or is it actually changing your engineering process, your manufacturing process?
I think it's really focusing on quality and building quality. I think that's going to reassure public that essentially their planes are safe to fly, and also reassure the customers that they don't have to worry about planes being pulled out of service for inspections and sort of the complexity of it, and having to restructure your operations based on that complexity. So I think the key question is getting to a point where you're assured of the quality of the aircraft, and that can sort of give it some stability in terms of airlines are happy, your customers are happy, and they're not worried about whether or not they're going to fly out of an aircraft. And I think that is really step one of it.
I mean, that feels like a fair thing.
I had an aisle seat. I'm okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, good point. Apparently, Alaska Air is commenting on the 737-900ER door plug in an email, saying that they find no issues so far in those checks. So that's something. So, Sid, normally, as in before today, I was on TV from 10 to 12 with Guy Johnson on the European close, and apparently there's like a storm and stuff, and I guarantee you this is all he would have been talking about for 2 hours, so I feel like I need to know about the storm and stuff over in Europe. What's going on with weather?
Yeah, so there's a storm Isha that's disrupting travel, causing power blackouts across northern Europe. There's hurricane force winds that are lashing the sort of northern Europe and the UK and Ireland. And so that's really disrupted travel, as well as sort of power supply to various homes in Ireland as well as the UK. And so I think that it's had a really big impact on Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, where they've cancelled 130 flights this morning, and they've talked about winds being over 100 kilometers an hour.
All right, Sid, thanks so much for joining us. Sid Phillip, Deputy Team Leader of Global Aviation for Bloomberg News. Global Entry. Do you have Global Entry?
Oh, yeah.
Saved our life. Okay, so coming back, Aruba, power out at the airport in the morning. That's a problem, apparently. So when you get there, lines everywhere out into the parking lot, crazy. You get through it, and in Aruba, you have to clear Aruban customs and U.S. customs.
That's right.
So you have to give 3 hours to get there, blah, blah, blah. That's when a smooth day. This was not a smooth day. So people were missing flights left and right, because when you go through the Aruban, go through all their stuff, and then you get to the U.S., and it's the same thing. You have to go through it all again. You have to take off your shoes again. If you didn't have, we get into the U.S. Customs Hall in Aruba, packed to the gills. You're never, ever going to make your flight. Global Entry, walked right up, right out.
Now, did the person you were traveling with also have Global Entry?
Yes.
Ah, okay,
so we
that's
just
the thing.
skated right through. We get on our plane, and it's packed on the way down, half full on the way back, because half the people didn't make it through.
No kidding.
Yeah. So it is just,
hurts.
for those out there who are kind of on the fence for Global Entry, if you do any international travel, man, is it
How do you
worth
get
it.
Global Entry?
Oh, it's a process. Go to the internet thing.
It's the same thing as the TSA. You have to have an interview and do a thing.
But it's so worth it if you ever travel
It's totally
overseas.
worth it. And it lasts a lot longer, I think, than the TSA stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it was 5 years. I just renewed it, but man, we were like worth the price just there for our good friends in Aruba. So hopefully the people got back, because there was a little bit of an issue there a couple of days ago. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker in the newsroom with the company news. We'll start off with Archer Daniels Midland. Right now, the shares 13% lower. The agricultural trading giant suspending its chief financial officer. They're cutting the earnings outlook pending an investigation into its accounting practices. Never a good sign. Victor Luthar had been the CFO since 2022, was put on administrative leave. ADM also delaying the fourth quarter earnings and the filing of its annual report and Form 10-K for 2023. A Digital World acquisition. This is the blank check firm that's seeking to take Donald Trump's media company public, surging after Ron DeSantis dropping out of the 2024 presidential race and endorsing Donald Trump. Thanks, but no thanks. Macy says it's not interested in a bid from Arkhouse Management and Brigade Capital Management to take over the retailer, claiming the offer lacked, in its words, compelling value. And one of Gilead Sciences' new drugs failed to significantly improve survival in a trial of patients with advanced lung cancer. It's a big blow to the targeted treatment that is one of the most promising classes in oncology. At Immerse Sports, they make Wilson tennis rackets and Solomon ski boots. They're seeking to raise as much as $1.8 billion in what would be one of the year's first major initial public offerings. And finally, we'll wrap up with this one. This is a study by the geniuses at MIT seeking to address fears about AI replacing humans in a bunch of industries. They found because AI is expensive to install and operate, humans, for the most part, did the job more economically, at least for now. So, I mean, we're safe for at least maybe a few more years.
So you guys are good.
Yeah, we're good.
I'm 45, so we're not sure. It could go either way.
Oh, you're good. Trust me. You're okay. And that's the company news. I'm John Tucker. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. S&P 500 up 0.3%. The NASDAQ up about 0.3% as well, but the Russell up 1.5%. That's where the action is today. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Mars.
Thank you, Paul. The race for the GOP presidential nomination is now down to two major candidates.
We can't ask our supporters to volunteer their time and donate their resources if we don't have a clear path to victory. Accordingly, I am today suspending my campaign.
Florida Governor DeSantis suspended his campaign yesterday, endorsing former President Trump. DeSantis was considered a frontrunner early on, but finished a distant second in the Iowa caucus and was polling in single digits ahead of tomorrow's New Hampshire primary. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson has dropped out of the race and has thrown his support behind Nikki Haley.
It's not just New Hampshire, but it is long-term, a one-on race between Nikki Haley and Donald Trump. And I'm all in for Nikki Haley.
The New Hampshire primary is tomorrow. Today is the anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision, but a lot has changed in 51 years. Republican-controlled states have all but banned the procedure, which Democrats plan to highlight in the lead up to the November election. Texas Democratic Party Executive Director Monique Alcala says that abortion rights is a winning issue with both independents and moderate Republicans.
I think that everybody is really concerned about the attacks on their personal freedom.
Alcala believes voters will shy away from politicians who push extreme measures like no exceptions for rape or incest. And Donald Trump's defamation trial in New York was postponed until tomorrow because of COVID precautions. One juror is reportedly ill. Two of Trump's attorneys are feeling kind of under the weather. Court has been adjourned and will not resume until tomorrow. A jury will decide how much money, if any, Trump must pay Jean Carroll for defaming her in 2019. She has first accused him of raping her decades ago in a department store dressing room. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Alex.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex, we were just talking airlines, aerospace. Well, here's a story about JetBlue. Joanna Garrity, she is the next chief of JetBlue Airlines. She spoke of having, quote, the gift of grit in a commencement address in 2020. You know what? She's going to need it. JetBlue on Friday said it would appeal a federal judge's decision to strike down its proposed acquisition of Spirit Airlines. The decision to appeal now sets up Garrity, who officially takes over JetBlue in February, with two seemingly impossible paths. She either prevails over the U.S. government and pushes through a merger with an already hobbled Spirit, or the deal flops and Garrity has to formulate a whole new strategy to pump life into her own unprofitable and struggling airline, which just brings up the question I always ask. Why would anybody go in the airline business? It is such a tough business.
It just feels like this is the absolute worst setup for a CEO to take the helm, not to mention the fact that she is a woman, and then you're basically handing a woman CEO, of which there aren't that many to begin with, a losing hand, and then when they lose, you're going to blame the woman CEO. I just feel like that's not cool.
And it's tough. I mean, just a tough business, I think. And I see some of these, folks that have made money in other businesses, and then they go into the airline business. I'm like, what? The airline, that being JetBlue, last made money in 2019 before the pandemic in a series of legal blows, in addition to a federal judge last week blocking the carrier's plan to acquire Spirit in a $3.8 billion deal. JetBlue's route-sharing partnership with American Airlines was shot down in the courts last year. Wall Street doesn't expect the airline to be so much as break-even until 2025.
Also, I mean, it could be worse, I guess. She could be the solo CEO of Spirit. Because at least JetBlue can still function. Maybe profitability will be a long way off, but you really have to wonder what Spirit's going to do if this merger doesn't wind up going through. And remember I was talking about SNL and Boeing and Alaska Air? Apparently, the tagline to this about ultra-cost airlines was still better than Spirit. So, like, not even on their problem, and they wind up getting a hit on SNL. I just wonder with the timeline now of this, too. Like, you take over in February, you're going to appeal. How long is it going to take?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I'm looking at JetBlue stock. It's only $1.7 billion market cap company. I mean, these regional airlines, it's just a brutal business. And, I don't know what happens here. A lot of folks say it's just going more and more market share going to the big players. So I have to keep an eye on that. S&P 500 up 0.25%. The NASDAQ also up 0.25%. So not much moving here. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
That's right. You are listening to Bloomberg Intelligence. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Coming up in this hour, we're going to check in with Bloomberg Intelligence Chief U.S. Interest Rate Strategist Ira Jersey to figure out where rates are going, where this Federal Reserve is going for the remainder of the year. Then we're going to get the latest on the upcoming New Hampshire primaries. We'll do that with the political news director for Bloomberg TV and Radio, Jody Schneider. She's all tapped in there in New Hampshire. And then we're going to get a markets call. Carol Schleif, Chief Investment Officer, BMO Family Office. She's going to join us to discuss the markets, inflation, rates, all that kind of good stuff as we continue to get through the month of January in 2024. But first, let's kick things off with Mr. John Tucker.
All right, the S&P 500 managed to log its first record close in more than 2 years on Friday, and that's boosting investor confidence carrying in today. We're adding to those gains. 7 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500, they are higher right now. Real estate is in the lead, and consumer discretionary, we'll call that a defensive sector. That's the biggest drag right now. But over at Evercore ISI, Julian Emanuel says, you know what, a 10% stock correction, not out of the question here.
Every now and then, things get ahead of themselves, and to us, this is one of these times where, look, the teasers talked about too many rate cuts being priced in, too much earnings anticipation being priced in, and all of those are likely going to cause a bit of a pause here.
All right, now the S&P 500, 8 points higher, 48 on the index, shaving some of those earlier gains. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 135 points right now. That's a rise of 0.4%. The NASDAQ 100 is 8 points higher. That is up less than 0.1%. Data today, big data have been in the red since April 2022, just after the Fed started raising interest rates. December's leading indicators notching another loss, a loss of 0.1%. Factory orders, consumer sentiment accounted for the bulk of the weakness in the Conference Board's report that we got out this morning. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We are live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. And Alex and I, this is day one of Bloomberg Intelligence. We're going to be focusing on company stocks as well as the markets here, trying to leverage some of the great research analysts we have, world-class research analysts we have at Bloomberg Intelligence. So we'll be bringing you that from 10 to 12 a.m. Eastern Time, Wall Street time, every day, weekday. Norma Linda joins us here. She's our stocks editor or stocks reporter for Bloomberg News, joining us here. We got a little bit of green on the screen here. Nora, what are you looking at?
Well, as I heard you both talking about earlier, Boeing is still in focus this week as scrutiny is spreading after federal regulators amped up their investigation into the manufacturing of the company's planes. The FAA has now shifted its attention to another 737 model where operators have also found issues with fasteners. As you both recall, the MAX 9 was the model on the Alaska Airlines flight earlier this month, but the one that we're looking at today is a 737-900ER. Boeing shares have already plunged 18% this year. That's marking the worst performance among members of the Dow Jones Industrial Average this year. We've got Boeing shares slipping as much as 1% in trading today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they talk about having to look at these planes. Technically, it takes like 8 hours to check it, right? So like it's not like that big. It's not like when the Boeing Max was lighting on fire. Like this is a different situation. So it feels like maybe once they just screw all the bolts in and figure it out, it can be up and running again.
That's what you hope. I remember thinking that or being told that at the beginning of the MCAS situation years ago. Oh, it's just a software fix. Don't be years.
That is an excellent point.
So I don't know how that all works.
I also remember the same thing being said about BP oil spill.
Oh, okay.
In the Gulf of Mexico. Like, it's not that big of a deal. And then
I can't even think back. I know you're on the front lines for that.
Yeah, 2010 maybe?
Yeah.
It was brutal.
Yep.
Brutal.
All right, what else do you have for us?
So this one's not so good, Paul. Gilead Sciences, that's ticker GILD. That's one to watch this morning after its drug Trodelvy failed to significantly improve survival in the trial of patients with advanced lung cancer. Shares are spiraling for their biggest drop in almost 9 years. It's plunging as much as 11%. This was a massive blow to the targeted treatment that's in one of the most promising classes of oncology. The company announced that patients receiving the drug didn't live significantly longer than those that are getting chemotherapy alone.
So here's John Murphy, the analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. He's out with his recent event reaction here. This is where the research guys come out with, like, within instance of a big piece of news coming out, they come out with their research. He's just saying, basically, just as the market saying, this is a major disappointment, albeit in a space where the bar is high and there's been limited progress in recent years.
Well, also the issue is, I think that from what I understand is that Gilead was pretty bullish on the study. And so since the third quarter, analysts have been bullish on it too. And then all of a sudden, JK, just kidding, it's not going to work out. So the expectation game also. All right, what else you got?
Fell short. Ending with the one that we started with earlier, Archer Daniels Midland, that's ticker ADM, is plunging as much as 18%, its most since 2005. Now, this is the biggest laggard by percentage in the S&P 500 after the agricultural trading giant suspended its CFO and cut its earnings outlook ahead of a pending investigation into its accounting practices. We spoke earlier about how this isn't the first scandal involving the company. Back in the 1990s, it was implicated in a price-fixing conspiracy that later became the basis of the 2009 film, The Informant.
Also, some of these price targets, reading some of the analyst commentary, Stifel Nicolaus cutting the price target by more than half for ADM. I mean, that is brutal. Yeah. They had a downtrend in earnings, and then the recent accounting issue. Overall, a sustained headwind to valuation on shares. That is brutal.
Terrible.
Yeah, I mean, you get those, the CFO leaving, that's just generally not a good thing, and it just brings up legal overhang for a long time. And if you're an investor, you're like, that's not what I signed up for. All right, Nora, thanks so much for joining us, Norma Linda. She covers all the stocks for Bloomberg. We appreciate getting a few minutes of her time here. January 31st, that's the next Fed meeting, right? So we got that
blackout period now.
Yeah, blackout period. But that doesn't mean we can't talk to Ira Jersey because he doesn't have blackout periods because we pay him to work every single day. Ira Jersey, Chief U.S. Interest Rate Strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. All right, Ira, it's your Federal Reserve, my friend. What do you think they're going to do here? And what do you think they, I don't know. I kind of feel like they can just kind of hang and let things kind of play out. But what do you think?
Well, this is all about signaling in this meeting. That not only does the market not think that they're going to do anything, but I think Governor Waller last week made it pretty clear that, the Fed's not in a rush to cut interest rates anytime soon. So the question is, will they push against the potential for a March cut? Because right now the market's about 50-50 on whether or not we're going to see a rate cut in March. I do think that at this point we'll probably see the first rate cut before mid-year, so either in May or June. And then the question is, what's the pace thereafter, right? So the market seems to think that if they start cutting, say, in June, that they're going to keep cutting every single meeting. I'm not convinced that they're necessarily going to do that. But nonetheless, that's kind of, I think, the debate that's going on, and something that maybe Jay Powell will clear up at the meeting next week.
So Ira, previously you were all about they're going to cut a lot later than we think, but when they do, it's going to be a lot of cuts. Where are you now with that?
Yeah, so that's still more or less our outlook on it. We just pulled forward 3 months our first cut. So originally we thought that they were going to cut in November. Now we think that they're more likely to cut before the conventions, the political conventions, because even though they won't ever admit this, I think the Federal Reserve wants to try to stay away from being seen as a political animal. And Governor Waller last week really solidified and kind of nuanced my view a little bit on that, because the Fed does seem interested in reducing the Fed funds rate as inflation continues to fall. So assuming inflation plays out, and I'm talking about the PCE deflator, which comes out later this week for the month of December, as that continues to fall, then the Fed doesn't want the difference between the Fed funds rate and their preferred measure of inflation to get too big, and so they want to kind of calibrate that. That was even a word that Waller used. We've been using that for a while. But if they do try to calibrate, then it makes sense for them to lower interest rates a little bit over time. But maybe that's every other meeting, right? And when they start will depend on how inflation shapes up. And inflation, quite frankly, is shaping up a little bit to be a little bit lower than I thought it was going to be. So that's the other big factor in what switched our view from first cut in November to first cut in June.
Ira, talk to us about the balance sheet. What's the Fed doing? Are they still performing quantitative tightening, and how should we think about that and the timing and all that stuff?
Yeah, so the Fed's still running off its balance sheet at $60 billion of treasuries and whatever runs off of mortgages as people prepay their mortgages, which is very little, right?
Oh,
so
right.
They've never actually reached the cap on mortgages, given where mortgage rates are. So they'll continue to do that. So they again have nuanced that view a little bit too, to suggesting that at some point in the not too distant future, and again, I think that this is another piece that could come out of at least the minutes of this meeting, if not the press conference, when Jay Powell speaks after the meeting next week, about when they might think about tapering and reducing the amount of balance sheet runoff that they do. If they reduce the balance sheet runoff starting in May, then we actually think that they might not end quantitative tightening until 2025. And once they do, but so it's just going to be like a slow meandering process, and that's where I think the Fed is going to have to kind of guide us to how they're going to do that. Also, will they continue to let mortgages run off? Because one of the pieces that we've always thought is that the Fed may continue to run off the mortgage part of their balance sheet and then reinvest that money into Treasury securities in order to keep the balance sheet the same size, but to try to get to more of a Treasury-only portfolio over time. And again, Governor Waller and some other speakers like Lori Logan and others have discussed that that's a distinct possibility.
So Ira, the other sort of thesis of sort of how the Fed will cut and why, Simon White's been talking a lot about this on MLive, and it's about the reserves in the system, right? And the idea that reserves are declining and at some point are going to reach a level where it just means there's just liquidity is too tight. And that's where using the balance sheet versus cuts might actually wind up helping the Fed. Or it's all about inflation or jobs. What do you think about that argument? What's the there?
Well, so I think that the balance sheet policy at this point is going to be disconnected from rate policy. They're going to be two different things. So the Federal Reserve still thinks that the balance sheet is too big and they'd like to get it smaller. But how small it can get is what you described. It's really dependent on the demand for reserves by the financial sector, in particular the big banks. All of the capital regulations that were put in place after the global financial crisis incentivize banks to hold a significant amount of bank reserves. And regardless of what happens to the top line interest rate, so where the Fed funds rate is and what the Federal Reserve is paying on those reserves, that matters, I think, a lot less than do they help comply with these various capital requirements. So most strategists, us included, think that it's somewhere around $2.5 trillion of reserves will be needed. Now, that is a moving target based on the size of the banking sector in general. But if that's true, then sometime around the end of the year, or maybe early next year, again, depending on how quickly they run off their balance sheet and do they taper the runoff of the balance sheet in the future, you'll wind up seeing that reserve level get hit. There is a canary in the coal mine. It's their standing repo facility. So that's something that as soon as you start to see banks tap that standing repo facility, that'll be a sign that we've reached that lowest comfortable level of reserves, and the Fed will have to probably end its quantitative tightening program.
All right, the only thing I know about the yield curve is it's inverted, and Lisa Bromwitz tells me that's important. I have no idea why. But we've got it, I don't know, it's still inverted, but only about, 27, 28 basis points. Do I take anything from that, or I just kind of file it away?
Well, it's a lot less inverted than it was, right? Paul, we talked about this last year. At one point, we were negative 100 basis points, right? We were inverted 2s, 10s by 100 basis points. The market's pricing right now, if you look at the implied forward rates for that curve to get to around plus 30 basis points, so about 60 basis points of yield curve steepening by the end of the year. I think that's a little bit optimistic, but I do think that by the end of this year, the 2s, 10s curve will be positive. It does mean that 2-year yields probably are going to have fallen a lot faster than 10-year yields, and part of that's just bond math, quite frankly, because if the Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates this year and next year, then the 2-year yield over time will have to come down just to create a no arbitrage situation. Right now, at around 4.35%, where it is today, that's signaling that the Fed is going to be cutting interest rates 125 basis points this year, and then another 75 or so next year. So would not be a big surprise to see the curve uninvert sometime in the third or fourth quarter of this year.
So the short-term rates are going to be really sensitive, like you said, 2/10s, in terms of pricing out some of the cuts, maybe, for example. What about the belly? Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan likes buying the dip in the 5-year. What do you think?
Yeah, so typically speaking, 5s tend to lead when the Fed's going to get into a cutting or hiking cycle. They really haven't outperformed as much as you would think if the Federal Reserve was going to be very aggressive in their cutting. So I do think that there's the possibility that 5s could start to catch up versus everything else. But that means, something like the 5-year, 30-year curve could just get even steeper than it is today, where you wind up seeing 30 years not do a whole heck of a lot. I think 30s will probably still rally if the whole market rallies, but you wind up seeing probably 2s and 5s just rally a lot further. The advantage of that from a market standpoint and just from a total return standpoint is if 5s have a meaningfully higher relationship between their price and yield. So as yields go down, if yields go down the same in 2s and 5s, you're going to make more money being in 5s. So I think it's an interesting part of the curve for investors to consider if they want to get long the market.
All right, Ira. Lionel Messi came to Major League Soccer here in the U.S. Huge success for him, for his team, for Apple. So from that perspective, all good. But I don't see any other stars in their prime coming over. What's going on there?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say that Lionel Messi's in his prime.
Right.
So I think Major League Soccer has shifted from where it was. It used to try to get a lot of aging stars, like in the New York Red Bulls, for example, wound up getting Thierry Henry, who was a Chelsea legend, an Arsenal legend, for example. And you had David Beckham come over kind of, in the later half part of his prime of his career. You still have some coming. They're just not the absolute marquee names, but you get folks in their prime that maybe are journeymen in the Premier League, or they're reasonably big stars in, say, Mexico or an Argentinian club, and then they come here. And one of the things that you've seen with guys like Miguel Almirón, who came from South America, went to Atlanta United, now he's playing in the Premier League. People, I think, want to get that kind of pathway going, and that's been more of the mantra for a lot of the MLS teams.
This sports? You guys talking about sports?
Yeah.
We moved on from the curve.
Yes,
That
we
was
moved
not
on
about the
from
Fed?
No.
Okay.
Ira is also, his day job is the interest rate thing, but his real interest is soccer. And he's way into it.
Like the actual football.
And he actually is part owner of a Real Central New Jersey, which is a minor league soccer team. So he's all into this stuff. So we can always, if we have to kill 30 seconds, what's going on in the world of soccer? And Ira will go. So he does it all. We appreciate it. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Well, stocks are adding to their record gains that we saw on Friday. But pairing some of the earlier gains that we saw this morning, Western Digital among the leaders in the S&P 500. That's up right now 3.6%. It was named top U.S. semiconductor pick at Morgan Stanley. And then you have Archer Daniels Midland and Gilead Sciences. They're among the laggards in the index right now. Well, betting on a March rate cut from the Fed, 2/3 Bloomberg Markets Live Pulse respondents say that betting on early monetary easing is one of their words, most foolish among popular trades heading into 2024. Right now, the S&P 500, 15 points higher. That's up 0.3%. 48.55 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 155 points. That's a rise of 0.4%. And the NASDAQ 100 right now up 47 points. That is up 0.3%. Two-year yield down 1 basis point. That's at 4.37. The 10-year, 3 basis points lower. That's at 4.09%. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
Thank you so much, John Tucker. So I'm Alex Steele, joined by Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence. We're going to have 2 hours where we focus on the Bloomberg Intelligence research that our group does. Amazing stuff, 2,000 companies and 130 industries that we cover worldwide as we dissect everything from politics to the markets and everything else in between. And speaking of, we have the New Hampshire primary kicking off tomorrow. And understanding how the election and policies are going to influence all these companies and all these industries is going to be key based on your returns for the end of the year. Joining us now, political news director for Bloomberg TV and Radio, Jody Schneider from New Hampshire. Jody, it's been a very turbulent 24 hours in the political world. What is life there on the ground without DeSantis on the ballot?
Yeah, it has been. We got the news that Ron DeSantis was dropping out yesterday, as some of us were about to head to cover a rally of his. So that's how kind of sudden it was. And he, of course, endorsed former President Donald Trump. So that really is kind of making it a harder battle for Nikki Haley. She is trying to win here in New Hampshire. She needs a very strong showing tomorrow in the primary to stay in this race, to stay competitive against Donald Trump. And that's going to be tough, given that Ron DeSantis threw his support to his former rival, Donald Trump. And also, we have had some others throw their support, including Tim Scott, the senator from Nikki Haley's home state of South Carolina, who she put into his job. He threw his support as he exited the race, after he exited the race, to Donald Trump as well. So it's a two-person race, but Donald Trump is certainly the one to beat.
So I guess, is there any scenario here where Nikki Haley and her team can claim some type of victory to maybe keep going here? What would be a win?
Yeah, a win would be an actual win if we had a surprise upset and she came in first. If she came in a strong second, Tim, she could claim victory that she did well against sort of the very strong front runner. The problem with that is that South Carolina, in a month from now, we have Nevada in between, but South Carolina is the next significant race, the next significant primary contest. And even though she's the former governor, Donald Trump is expected to do very well there, especially with that endorsement from Tim Scott. So this makes it really hard for her. And unless she does really well tomorrow, the betting is that she will drop out before South Carolina and an embarrassment in her home state. The question a lot of people are already asking is, will she endorse Donald Trump on her way out?
So she has said that she will vote for the Republican nominee, but will her supporters do that? So I'm really curious as to what's going to happen to the independents, to the centrist Republicans and the centrist Democrats if Nikki Haley bails. Where are we hearing they're going to go?
Yeah, I mean, there won't be much place for them to go in terms of the rest of the primaries. It's feeling like all but inevitable that Donald Trump, unless, again, we have a really surprise upset tomorrow, that he will be the nominee for the party, and an early nominee. This will be the earliest, certainly in recent memory, that we've seen the two candidates, the general election contenders, determined. The question, I guess, is what happens to them in the fall? Do they maybe cross over and vote for the Democratic nominee, or do they just stay home? And a lot of people think there's going to be a lot of staying home without much enthusiasm overall for either candidate, and it really will become who can turn out their folks. There's also the question of a third party candidate. We have No Labels, a group that has said that if they don't have anybody besides Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that they would look at a third-party candidate. But there may be some independents that crop up that start to get some resonance given this sort of inevitability and given the fact, as we've seen in polling, that a lot of people would prefer somebody other on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, would prefer somebody other than who they're going to likely get in Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
So, Jody, what's the thinking in the Beltway these days in Washington about if we do get what seems to be the inevitable Biden versus Trump race in November? How does that go? Who's got the edge? What's the early thinking there?
Yeah, again, I think it will be a very close race. People are saying, and people we're talking to here in New Hampshire, political prognosticators, pundits, we call them, they are saying it's going to get ugly. It's going to get ugly fast. And it really will be interesting to see if the public, what the public thinks of that and what the polls say. We're also dealing with two men quite, older. The current president is 81. Donald Trump is 77. You are looking at really a lack of enthusiasm from younger voters, certainly, about what they're seeing. So the question will be, would a third-party candidate get some resonance, or are people just going to sort of hold their nose and vote for the candidate they find the least objectionable? And again, we may be looking at a record low turnout, record low participation general election if something doesn't happen to excite voters, because right now they are not excited.
Right. It's like, did those centrists just stay home, which would be a bizarre turnout too. Jody, what sort of policies should the market start to pay attention to? Things like making the Trump tax cuts permanent, obviously tariffs on anything being imported into the country. It feels like either way, enormous budget deficits are here to stay, which I know is weird to say when you're also floating a staunch Republican on the ticket. What do we start to pay attention to now?
Yeah, I think all those things you mentioned, Alex, are really good points for the markets and investors to start looking at. As this becomes inevitable that we have Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, we know that both have had a lot of spending on their plates, and some of this was pandemic, came from the pandemic and those huge the paychecks, the checks that went to everybody. But also on the tariffs, we saw Donald Trump put in place those China tariffs, and they have not been removed by Joe Biden. So I think there's some things here that investors can start thinking about. These are likely to be what we will see with these two men. We will also see how do they work with Congress. That's the other thing we haven't really had much of a chance to talk about. We will in coming months. Both chambers of Congress are really up for grabs. It is widely expected that the Republicans could lose control of the House, given what happened, particularly with their speaker fights this past year. The Senate, the Democrats there have a harder map to maintain control of the Senate than the Republicans do. So there's a lot of issues there. Who will work well with Congress? Will they get much done?
Well, given that backdrop of just the calendar, Jody, being an election year, what does Congress have to get done? Don't they have to keep the government open? That's kind of important. And they've got some big bills as it relates to foreign aid, which I know being tied to immigration. What's the expectation in Washington how that might proceed in an election year?
Yeah, so they do have to keep the government open. They've been able to do these short-term CRs, and we've had several rounds of threatened shutdowns. We haven't had that occur yet, but they just keep passing these short-term continuing resolutions. They just passed another one last week that gets us to March, to right around Super Tuesday and right around State of the Union. So they do, and there seems to be a lot of talk of trying to get away from this, but the Speaker Johnson, has a very narrow path to get things done. Even if he wants to do things, he has the flank of his party that really keeps pushing for deeper and deeper budget cuts and doesn't want him to work with Democrats, but he needs to work with Democrats. So it's a tough situation. But at the same time, we may see something happen on tax policy. There's a bill that went through the House Ways and Means Committee. They actually marked it up. They sat down and went through it last week that would provide business tax cuts, making some of those Trump era tax cuts permanent or extending them, and also the child tax credits that the Biden administration wants to see extended. That may happen, and if it happens, it would happen pretty quickly because they want to do this, particularly with that child tax credit, before the tax filing season gets into full swing. So we may see some tax policy. We may see an immigration bill. We have not had immigration policy changes of any major sense, really, in 20 years. But they need to get this done. The Republicans are saying they need immigration policy changes before they will even consider extending or giving more aid to Ukraine, as well as Israel and Taiwan.
Jody, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Joey Schneider, Bloomberg Political News Director for TV and radio. And I can tell you, Paul, the thing is that Europe's going to have to get its act together, figure out a way to fund itself, beef up its military, and go on its own. I feel like either way, this is the takeaway in some ways for Europe that you can start actually betting on.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the issues here, and I just kind of feel like it's. I don't know how this Congress is going to get anything done during an election year, but there are some, as Jody was mentioning, some things that have to get done.
Sure.
So absolutely.
In theory.
So we'll have to see there. One of them is keeping the government operational. S&P 500 up 1/3 of 1%. The NASDAQ up 0.5 of 1%. Russell up 1.64%. Let's head down to Washington, D.C. right now. Amy Marsh has got world and national news for us.
All right, thank you, Paul and Alex. Just in time for the New Hampshire primary, down to 2 candidates for the GOP presidential nomination. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis dropped out and endorsed Donald Trump. New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu tells Bloomberg's Joe Matthew and Kayleigh Lyons why he's throwing his support behind Nikki Haley.
Now, I don't think any of these early states are must-wins for Haley. I don't think that's ever been the case. They're possible, but they're not must-wins. I think when you get to Super Tuesday, okay, now you really have to start winning states, obviously. But as long as she keeps building on that momentum, I think there's a lot of opportunity. She has money, she has resources, she has, knows how to win in New Hampshire, knows how to win in South Carolina. So all the wind is at her back.
New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu. Bloomberg's Laura Davison also in New Hampshire, part of our political team covering the first in the nation primary tomorrow. Davison says that Nikki Haley does need to keep looking forward to find out what happens now.
Even if she is able to pull out a win on Tuesday, Super Tuesday is not that far away in early March. She doesn't have more New Hampshires where she can have some of these upsets, which that sort of calls into question the viability of her campaign going forward.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison says there are a lot of independent, undeclared candidates that might give Haley a boost that the polls sometimes miss. Dozens of relatives of Israelis held hostage by Hamas stormed a parliamentary committee meeting after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected what he said were unacceptable terms presented by Hamas for a new hostage deal. More from Bloomberg's Sylvia Westall.
It's quite hard to overstate just how big a change, a shift in public opinion there's been in Israel as well. There's a real sense that the country is at war, that it must defeat Hamas. So there's all these internal pressures happening.
Bloomberg's Sylvia Westall reporting from Dubai. Officially, 132 hostages remain in Gaza, although 27 are known to be dead. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker, the Bloomberg Newsroom, with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Stocks are higher, but right now they're off the best levels of the session after Friday's record close. Western Digital, among the biggest individual movers in the index, it was named a top U.S. semiconductor pick by Morgan Stanley. Biggest laggard, well, that belongs to Archer Daniels Midland with that accounting probe going on there. At Citigroup Global Markets, meantime, Stuart Kaiser says, you know what, the mood of investors is generally pretty positive.
Yeah, I think the news is so good. I think the bar's a little bit higher, this year than it was last. If we were sitting here in, January 2023, it'd be a much different discussion in terms of where expectations were. So yeah, the data's coming in good. I think there's a few more blemishes on the data probably than we've seen in the last few months, and that's gotten people, a little bit cautious.
We did get some data this morning, economic report, in fact, the index of leading economic indicators dropping again for the month of December. It's a barometer of the economic outlook. It's been falling since April of 2022. S&P 500 right now, 13 points higher. That is up about 0.3%, 48.53 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 105 points. That's up 0.3%. The Nasdaq 100, 44 points higher, and that is up 0.3%. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, and this program is Bloomberg Intelligence. We try to focus on companies, stocks, as well as the general markets. We like to focus in with and use a lot of our Bloomberg Intelligence research analysts, so you'll be seeing and hearing a lot of them coming forward. Let's talk about these markets here. I mean, we started off the first few days of trading selling off, and a lot of people said, that makes sense. We had that huge run at the end of the year. But now we found a little bit of stability here. So let's check in and see what some of these professionals are doing. Carol Schleif, she's one of them. She's the Chief Investment Officer for the BMO Family Office. Carol, thanks so much for joining us here. A lot of folks were starting this year saying, boy, that huge gain we had in the last couple of months of 2023, that probably pulled some performance from 2024 a little bit forward here. We're going to be a little bit bumpy here in the beginning. What's your take on kind of that thought, and kind of when you talk to your clients, what are you telling them about 2024?
Yeah, we definitely agree that markets got a little over their skis with exuberance in the last couple of months of 2023. But the great part was to see the broadening of it not just being the primary Magnificent Seven, or even if you took it out to 10 or 12 of those top tech names driving the majority of last year's market. So we did think you'd see some pullback in here. We do think for sustainability for markets to behave themselves well again this year, you do need to continue to see that broadening out, which you really didn't see in the last couple of weeks as things have stabilized. But it's not unusual at all when you have that kind of run up going into year end, especially at the late trading volume you would have had between Christmas and New Year's, when a lot of those highs were approached, if you will. It's not unusual at all to see a kind of reassessment of that. You've also had a pretty major reassessment in terms of timing and quantity of Fed cuts, because a lot of the market exuberance in late last year was looking for cuts starting in March, which we don't think you'll see.
Just to update everybody, Archer Daniels Midland down 22%, most on record. Sure, there are reasons, cutting its outlook, the CFO on leave. There's some issues in the accounting practices, but nonetheless, if you miss or get hurt in this market, you can get really, really hurt. Yeah. Carol, do you buy the rip that we've seen over the last couple days?
Do I buy the, I'm sorry.
Do you buy the rip? Do you buy the rally?
Oh, yeah, I think, I'm not sure it's pulled back necessarily far enough, but with cash on the sidelines, I think it is time, because a lot of people have been very comfortable sitting in cash, and it's time to start locking in either some positions in the stock market, some longer term, even going out to 5 years or a little more in the fixed income markets. We do think you'll see that 10-year gravitate more towards 4.25%, 4.5% by the end of the year, but locking in some potential investments and moving it out of cash, where it's been arguably a really great place to sit through much of last year. But when the Fed gets around to starting to cut, you'll see some of the nice yields on those money market accounts disappear.
You know, Carol, when I started on Wall Street in the mid '80s, Japan was the bomb. I mean, that was a place that was growing like crazy. If you wanted to further your career on Wall Street, you had to do a stint in the Tokyo office. And then for the last 20 or 30 years, there's been nothing, no growth, no place, and nobody really paid attention to it. Now I'm starting to hear people talk about Japan. I see that in your notes. I even heard Warren Buffett talk about Japan. How are you thinking about Japan here?
I think I too started when Japan Inc. was the cover story on Business Week, and I probably still have that cover in my file someplace. But I think then as you so aptly noted, we went into 20 or 30 years worth of it trying to rally and come back out and disinflation hitting. But there's a lot of things structurally that are going on in Japan right now. And by and large, the globe is underweighted in that very key developed market. But there's a lot of things, for example, governance issues going on with publicly held companies there, where over half of them are trading below book value. And there's new regulatory oversight saying that you need to get a plan in place. You need outside directors on the board, a plan in place to get those stock prices up. And there's a lot of things structurally going on there that make us very interested in it. And again, the fact that most of the globe is pretty severely underweighted in Japan because of the fact that it's been 30 years since they were on magazine covers.
So, yeah, fair enough. And this kind of pairs in with your Fed call, too, right? We're all kind of waiting for the BOJ to at least end 0%, right? At least a little bit of a baby hike. But that hasn't happened. You mentioned that the Fed isn't going to be cutting in March. And I'm wondering how you look at the timing of all of this and then how you deal with equities out of it.
Well, I think the piece of it is that the direction is in the right direction. We think the Fed's done raising. Whether they cut in March or May or June or July, it's almost not
as relevant.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, not enough caffeine this morning. It's not as relevant there in terms of it's directionally. The Fed most likely is done raising, is going to start cutting at some point. And so we think it does tee up a pretty constructive market. Those who are lending to companies have the opportunity to, okay, now we can firm up our models and figure out what our prospects are for the next 3 to 5 years. The trend is for more rate cuts. The Fed has ample room in here if our economy does start to tail off. Now they have ample room in here to be able to cut more aggressively at some point if they need to. But you've seen a very healthy market in here. That employment numbers out late last week were very solid and indicative of markets that are coming into better balance. Consumers are pretty exuberant. Investors are pretty constructive. But as long as we hopefully get to see a broadening out of mid caps and small caps participating more and more industries other than just technology driving this rally, we think you'll have a pretty reasonable year.
All right, Carol, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate getting a few minutes of your time. Carol Schleif, Chief Investment Officer, BMO Family Office. And I'm old enough to remember that BMO stands for Bank of Montreal. How about that?
Very good.
How about that?
Wow.
Yeah.
You're old. No, I'm
Canadian
kidding.
banks are
I'm totally
great.
kidding. You're not.
He's experienced.
He's experienced.
Exactly.
I'm messing with him.
All the firms I worked for on Wall Street, goodbye, no longer exist.
Really?
Yes. Payne Weber, boom.
That's crazy.
Merrill Lynch, boom. Wheat First Securities, boom. Salomon Brothers.
You didn't work at Bear?
Credit Suisse. No, I did not work at the Bear.
But even if you did, that would also be gone. So
Yes.
there is that.
Almost worked at the Bear, but Victor Miller took that job, so I went to Credit Suisse. So yeah. Anyway, crazy things there.
That is pretty crazy. But that's why I like talking to you, because you have a totally different perspective.
Totally different perspective.
Of like what
He's
Wall
driven
Street
more
should
companies into insolvency than anybody.
So he
I
knows
know.
about
the latest one was
bankruptcy.
Odyssey.
He knows about this.
So, right.
Yeah, the largest owner of radio stations, formerly known as Entercom. Yeah, so that's a little problem there. So the radio industry. Looking at the markets, how was your first day?
It was really fun.
Isn't this fun?
But it's just like talking to you every week that we do, but now it's just 2 hours every day.
2 hours every day.
It's different.
Exactly right. Exactly.
I love radio.
S&P 500 up about 0.3%. The NASDAQ just about 0.4%. And again, the Russell up 1.5%. Yields, we got the 10-year Treasury, 4.09% on your 10-year Treasury. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg Intelligence.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker in the news. I've got to do this one because this is like slowing down to see an accident on the side of the road. ADM, Archer Daniel Midland, right now 22% lower. The agricultural giant suspending its chief financial officer, cutting its earnings outlook pending a probe into its accounting practices. ADM also delaying its fourth quarter earnings and the filing of its annual report. Digital World Acquisition, this is the blank check firm seeking to take Donald Trump's media company public, surging after Ron DeSantis dropped out of the presidential race and endorsed Trump. And this is a former White House chief usher during Donald Trump's presidency, raising about $100 million for a real estate fund to help first-time home buyers make down payments. This is Timothy Harleth. He's launching Generational Equity Labs. This is a Washington-based fund. They plan to use a technology platform linking would-be homebuyers to institutions that will essentially co-invest in a concept dubbed equity sharing. So investors are going to be able to buy and sell their shares of the real estate funds that hold the home equity stakes. I had to look this up. What's the usher at the White House? He's the head of the household staff there. Nice. And supermarkets missing out on untapped revenue from selling food that's about to expire as store workers waste hours searching for those short-dated products and discounting them by hand. At least that's the pitch from Too Good To Go. This is an 8-year-old Danish company that's cut its teeth addressing restaurant food waste. They're now turning to grocery stores' soon-to-expire goods. Starting this month, TGTG selling an artificial intelligence-powered solution that assists these supermarkets with expiration dates. And that is your company news. I'm John Tucker.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets right here, S&P 500 is up 1/3%. The NASDAQ a little bit better, up about 0.5%. And the Russell, the small cappers, outperforming once again. You like to see that, up 1.5%. 10-year Treasury yields pulling back just slightly, 4.08. We'll call it WTI crude oil up about 2%, just under $75 per barrel. So we'll keep an eye on that. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get rolled in national news with Amy Mars.
All right, thank you, Paul. The race for the Republican presidential nomination down to two candidates now, Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. Haley pulling no punches on this eve of the New Hampshire primary.
Everybody talks about the economy that Trump gave us and how good it was. And it was. But at what cost? He put us $8 trillion in debt.
Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines is in Manchester, New Hampshire, where she says a more moderate voter base will be key for Haley's chances tomorrow.
What she's going to try to do here in New Hampshire is capture all of the independents, more moderate Republicans that she is trying to cater to. That's what New Hampshire is known for. But at this point, polling is suggesting that that just might not be enough. In the latest Suffolk University Boston Globe poll that came out this morning, she is behind Trump by 19 points.
Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines in New Hampshire. North Dakota Republican Governor Doug Burgum says he will not seek a third term as governor. Today's announcement comes more than a month after he ended his bid for the GOP presidential nomination. Now there's some speculation about him serving in a second Trump administration. This year's winter storm put the Texas power grid to the test, and it passed. There were no rolling brownouts last week, even with all the record energy use. Todd Staples heads the Texas Oil and Gas Association and says it all worked as promised.
The Texas Division of Emergency Management, PUC, ERCOT, were all on the phone throughout the storm, and the results are that Texans remain warm in their homes.
Staples says there needs to be more investment in forecasting tools. Twice last week, there were calls for conservation, but demand never got close to supply. And eating dark chocolate could help lower the risk of high blood pressure? Tell me more. A new study in the journal Nature Scientific tells us that dark chocolate may also decrease the risk of blood clotting. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Alex.
All righty, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Alex, you know, one of the parts of Wall Street I find fascinating, really just, it's really been the last 10, 15 years, is this private lending, direct lending, private credit business. It's just been an explosion. Now, these private lending funds have been mostly funding small and mid-sized deals, but now there's an interesting story on the Bloomberg terminal here. Direct lenders are vying with banks to finance a potential buyout of DocuSign with a debt package totaling as much as $8 billion. That's according to people with knowledge of the matter. Bain Capital and Hellman & Friedman, some private equity folks, they're jockeying to acquire the electronic signature platform, though the discussions are ongoing and details may change. That's according to people. But it's interesting. The proposed loan would be the largest ever direct lending deal by roughly $3 billion, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. And it comes at a time when the competition between banks and direct lenders is reaching a fever pitch. I mean, there's so much money going to this private credit business. I mean, we all grew up with private equity, but private credit just kind of came about really after the great financial crisis when the banks were kind of pulling back a little bit.
At the same time, when the banks have more regulation, aka Basel III Endgame, and they have to put more money aside to help finance losses, etc., does that wind up crimping what they're able to do? Does that put more money over into the private credit guys? Or does this just mean that DC at some point regulators are going to come knocking on private equity and private credit's door and say, okay, guys, we need more transparency. We need to know what these loans actually look like and see what risk there is into the system and when that's tested.
That's kind of what I'm thinking of. But we have some, I can't remember who we get. We'll get them in here. We have some good private credit folks that come in here and talk to us about the business. Have really educated us here. But when I was at the Chase Manhattan Bank, this was our business. We did leverage lending. I didn't need assets. All I needed was cash flow, and I'll lend you a multiple of the cash flow. And a lot of people weren't doing that because that's risky lending it, because you think about the collateral, there really isn't any other than the cash flow. So, but that's what this business is. They've been really getting to that leverage lending business, taking some of that risk off the banks. But if I'm the banks, why are they letting that business go? I mean, it was such a lucrative business for them.
Yeah, I know, because they might have to. This has been fun.
Yeah, good
stuff. You want to do it tomorrow?
Let's do it tomorrow.
Yeah, let's do it
10
tomorrow.
to 12. Bloomberg Intelligence, Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We'll be back here 10 tomorrow. We're going to have some fun here. This is Bloomberg.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Balance of Power.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Balance of Power. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself. Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
And then there were two. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, live from New Hampshire on the eve of the first in the nation primary, just a day after Ron DeSantis dropped out of the race. We're joined ahead by the person running this election. New Hampshire's Secretary of State David Scanlon will join us live from the Capitol in Concord. Also with us here in Manchester, the publisher of the influential, ever-important union leader, out with its endorsement of Nikki Haley. We'll have analysis from our signature panel. Rick and Jeannie are with us here in New Hampshire. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. They'll be back a little bit later on this hour, and we start, as always, on this new and improved Balance of Power Radio. With a look at Wall Street, Charlie Pallett has that for us in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. It only gets better here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. We are off session highs, though. Right now, we've got the S&P up another 17, up by about 0.3%. The Dow up 146 now, up by 0.4%, while NASDAQ up 75, higher by 0.5%. Well, here we are, just beyond the middle of January, and I'm going to be quoting year-to-date numbers. Yes, the year is young, but so far, the S&P up 1.8% on the year. The Dow this year up by 0.8%. And in the YTD column, we have got NASDAQ, the composite index, up 2.5% year to date. 10-year yield now 4.09% with a 2-year, 4.37%. Gold down $5.50 the ounce, down 0.3%. Crude now it's $74.83 a barrel, up by 1.9%. Stocks kept climbing after hitting a record last week as strong economic data and corporate results fueled Wall Street's appetite for risk. Well, 2024 is a presidential election year. Potentially, what could that mean for markets? Alicia Levine is head of investment strategy at Bank of New York Mellon.
What we see is $100 billion coming out of the gate in fiscal that's going to steady the corporate sector
and the household sector. And then 2024 is the year that $2 trillion of stimulus that was passed in the last couple of years for the IRA, the CHIPS Act, and the infrastructure bill is going to come on board. So you're starting to see the money pumping from Washington again, even though we thought it was all over, and it's not all over.
And another busy week for earnings. Netflix tomorrow up 0.7%. Tesla Wednesday down 1% right now. Intel Thursday up by 0.5%. Again, recapping, stocks push higher. S&P up 16, up 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, we thank you and welcome back to Manchester, New Hampshire, and an important day for us here on Bloomberg Radio as Sound On becomes Balance of Power. This is going to be the new drill. We'll join you live here at noontime, Washington time, on the daily here on the radio, the satellite, and YouTube. And our second hour will be joined as well on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Kaylee Lyons will be along. We'll still have Rick and Jeannie with us, and we meet here at quite a moment in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm bringing this to you live from Elm Street, not far away from where Donald Trump spoke the other night. And voting begins tomorrow, so this is it. Remembering that Nikki Haley, coming out of Iowa, said this is a two-person race. And I guess she was onto something because, of course, yesterday Ron DeSantis dropped out of the race, leaving us now with two. And new polling that we'll cover over the course of this hour that makes it look like a pretty heavy lift for Nikki Haley if she is, in fact, going to win this primary or come in a strong second. We begin our conversation here with the man running this election. David Scanlon is with us, the Secretary of State of New Hampshire, joining us live from the Capitol in Concord. And Mr. Secretary, I appreciate your coming along on this eve of the primary. I'd love to hear about what you think is going to transpire here. And I'd love to ask you about turnout to start. I'm here in Manchester where it kind of looks like any other Monday. We're used to the big primary carnival, and it's been a bit quiet this time, the sense of inevitability. What will that look like when it comes to turnout?
Well, I fully expect that there's going to be a good turnout tomorrow, certainly on the Republican side. President Trump has a good solid base that turns out for him, and the undeclared voters in New Hampshire seem to be motivated to turn out for the Republican primary. On the Democratic side, usually when there is an incumbent president running for a second term, the turnout is lower than normal. The unusual case this election is that President Biden's name was not on the ballot because he declined to file here based on the issues we've been having with the Democratic National Committee.
Well, in terms of the contested primary, it's Republicans, and I bring our listeners and viewers back to the record in 2016, 285,000. Of course, Donald Trump won that primary. Mr. Secretary, what do you think it'll look like this time?
Well, I made a prediction of 322,000 voters turning out. That would be a record number of Republicans turning out for a presidential primary. And the way I came up with that number was looking back at similar primaries and gauging turnout. This was a difficult one to predict because for the first time ever, we have two individuals that have served as president of the United States that are running in their respective primaries. And then, we have to look at how motivated the undeclared voters seem to be in the state to turn out and vote for a candidate in both parties. This time, the action's on the Republican side.
Mm-hmm. I'm compelled by the very practical nature of your work here, dealing with paper ballots, driving them to central locations. There's obviously a great conversation here about election integrity, election security. How confident are you that this will be a clean process tomorrow?
Well, this will absolutely be a clean process. There's no question in my mind. And what happens in a polling place in New Hampshire is that the moderator will open the polls at the appropriate time. The voters will cast their ballots. When the polls close, the moderator will come up with the final results at that polling place. Those results will be posted at the polling place. And then the return of votes will be filled out by the moderator that reflects those results. They will come to my office very early the following morning. and we will add them up to certify the final results. In New Hampshire, the polling places are actually run at the local level by locally elected officials, a moderator, a clerk, supervisors of the checklist, selectmen. They're all elected by their neighbors and friends and members of the community, and they get those jobs because of their integrity and their ability to do a good job. In a small state, we will have over 6,000 individuals working at the polls, and they're all average citizens of New Hampshire, but they're dedicated to doing a good job and reporting accurate results.
So with that said, why does New Hampshire have multiple closing times? How does that potentially complicate your job?
Well, it's not that complicated. In New Hampshire, the law says that polling places have to be open from a minimum of 11 in the morning till 7 o'clock. Many polling places have varying hours in the morning when they start up, but at the end of the night, most polling places close at 7 o'clock. And then there's a handful, maybe a couple dozen, that stay open until 8 o'clock. So those are the two closing times, and I would expect that even with the write-in effort taking place on the Democratic ballot for President Biden, that we will have results by the end of the night.
By the end of the night, I just wonder, after what happened in Iowa, how worried you might be for the Associated Press to make a call at 7 when you still have people in line potentially until 8 o'clock. They called the caucuses a half an hour into the process. Have you been in touch with the Associated Press? Will they wait until all polls are closed?
I have not been in touch with the Associated Press. I would expect, as in prior elections, that results or declared outcomes of the election won't be made until after 8 o'clock when all of the polls close.
Well, it sounds like you're looking for an impressive turnout despite what seems to be a relatively subdued primary, Mr. Secretary. Give us a bit of a seminar before you leave in geography. Where should we be watching tomorrow night in the communities and counties that will decide the outcome of this election? Is it those along the Mass border where you have a concentration of conservative Republican voters, or will we learn more as we go north through the evening?
New Hampshire has some interesting pockets of voter turnout, and I think you're correct. There are towns along the southern border with Massachusetts that are conservative and will vote heavily Republican. And then you move up into some of the cities, whether it's Nashua or Manchester, over on the seacoast, Portsmouth, or the town of Hanover, where Dartmouth College is. You would expect to see higher Democratic turnout there. I think, it's hard to say which towns are going to be bellwether towns in this election because it is very different.
Appreciate your joining us on the eve of the primary. Good luck tomorrow, Mr. Secretary. It's great to have you with us here on Bloomberg. David Scanlon live from the Capitol in Concord as we get things started here on the fastest show in politics. This is Balance of Power Radio on the satellite, on the old-fashioned radio, and here on YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thanks for being with us as we introduce two familiar voices and faces here, also with us here in the Bloomberg Bureau that we've set up on Elm Street in Manchester. Laura Davison is with us, Bloomberg Politics correspondent, along with Gregory Cordy. It's great to see both of you here, Gregory. Thanks for joining at the table. Laura, based on what we just heard, a bit ambitious maybe on the turnout front. How's that going to look tomorrow, based on your view?
Yeah, this is a kind of the real question and something that both campaigns are looking at closely. Haley's camp in particular wants a strong turnout, especially those undeclareds, which I think will be sort of the piece that makes the difference for them. Hampshire is a little bit weird in that you can sort of be undeclared. It's not necessarily independent, but you can go in and choose a ballot on primary day. So this is a thing that New Hampshireites take very seriously and, go to a bunch of events, meet these candidates, and end up deciding, potentially, in the final week up to the primary.
Yeah, you've both been on the ground for a few days here, Gregory. What's your thought on a high turnout tomorrow? Does that potentially advantage Nikki Haley?
I think the conventional wisdom, and it does, and it's precisely because of those undeclared independent voters that are more traditional Republicans. There are a lot of sort of white-collar professional suburbs in the lower tier of the state. They're really they're in New Hampshire, but you could really consider them suburbs of Boston.
That's right.
And they're within sort of long commuting distance, and those are suburbs that Nikki Haley is going to need a high turnout from if she's going to pull any kind of an upset here.
It's interesting when you consider, it's sort of counterintuitive. People think of suburbs as being more moderate, more liberal, but these are folks who work in Boston and have such an allergy to Massachusetts policy and taxes that they move just over the border here into New Hampshire. So while they may be functioning all day long in Massachusetts, they're going to decide likely who the next nominee is. That's advantage Nikki Haley?
Yeah, I mean, as Gregory said, this is really your traditional kind of country club type Republican. They're focused more on economic issues, low taxes, low regulation, but maybe a little bit more progressive on social issues. And they are close to Massachusetts, but have either, self-selected to live across the New Hampshire line where taxes are lower and regulations are a little bit more free. This is kind of where we see the shifting Republican Party of, areas that used to be, very strong for Republicans. Now, Nikki Haley's still appealing, Donald Trump not so much, and areas like this that Biden won in 2020.
We've got a lot of new polling out today. Pick your poll. We could talk about it, but they all came before Ron DeSantis dropped out of the race, Gregory. The conventional wisdom there is those votes go to Donald Trump. Those people weren't about to vote for Nikki Haley, and the timing here might be very difficult for her.
Well, keep in mind, it's only 6 or 7% of the electorate that Ron DeSantis is polling at, and so there's 3 options for those voters left, right? They can vote for Donald Trump, they can vote for Nikki Haley, or they can stay home. Or keep in mind, obviously, Ron DeSantis' name is still going to be on the ballot. I would expect, maybe even 1 or 2% might stick with him to send a message, even though he's not on the ballot.
Yeah.
He was at the stage where he wasn't going to get any delegates anyway. The delegates in New Hampshire are allocated proportionally, but you have to get at least 10% of the vote to get any delegates. So those votes probably go mostly to Trump. That's the conventional wisdom. The issues are more aligned there. DeSantis said all along had been pitching himself as a Trump-like Republican, a MAGA Republican, but with a little less baggage. But some of them may also go to Nikki Haley, just because if you're going to be for Trump, you probably have been for Trump all along, and maybe you were looking for a non-Trump alternative. But it's certainly not enough votes to make up the distance between Haley and Trump at this point.
We'll hear a bit later on from Governor Chris Sununu, who we spoke with before the broadcast, Laura. He's talking about a strong second, not actually winning this, as I feel like we were hearing a couple of weeks ago. He says that they never made that promise, and I guess we can assume that that's the case for now. But even if she wins New Hampshire, what's the path when you see the deficit that she's got in her home state of South Carolina?
It's a really tough path. And what you hear Sununu saying about a strong second, this is all expectation setting right now. They're still privately, can be hoping for that first place win. But, if she comes in, a close second can still, can publicly count that as a quote win.
Yeah.
But it's tricky. Part of the theory of her case is that it's a month until South Carolina, and that if she's able to come out of this with some momentum, she can use the Americans for Prosperity money, that Koch-backed money, to really build an operation in South Carolina to turn out the voters that she needs. It's still a really difficult case to make when you just look at the deficit she has with Trump and just the electorate there. It's a lot more similar to Iowa, a lot more evangelical, and she doesn't have quite the same advantage that she does in New Hampshire.
Which is saying something when that's your home state. But so it comes down to a case of momentum. That's the argument, right, Gregory? And you've been in touch with the Haley campaign. They say that these numbers will change if she outperforms in New Hampshire. But that's feeling like a wing and a prayer at this point, isn't it?
What has been remarkable to me about this entire campaign cycle is just how stable the race has been from the beginning. Trump's lead has seemed to be impenetrable, even as other candidates have surged, and it's really Haley who has really had the momentum, as you say. Trump's numbers haven't budged much. They've always been low 40s or high 40s to low 50s in terms of the poll numbers. And that 50% line is a magic line. Even if you were to consolidate all the anti-Trump support in the Republican Party, that means you still wouldn't get the numbers that you need to dislodge him from that perch. But yes, you're right. The Haley case is that obviously Trump is better known. He's been president before. As voters get to know her in each of these early primary states, that will build upon each other. And she will, more than likely, do better in New Hampshire than she did in Iowa. But then she's got to take it to the next step in South Carolina and do even better. And it's a tall hill to climb.
Got a lot to learn the next 24 to 48 hours. I'm glad you're with us. Gregory Cordy, Laura Davison, thank you. This Bloomberg.com.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the S&P 500 index pushing higher, back to work Monday with a gain right now of 0.3% on the S&P, which is at 4854, up 14 points. The Dow up 0.4%, up 131. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 42, up 63 points. The outperformer, those small cap shares, with the Russell 2000 now up by 1.5%. 10-year yield 4.09%. The 2-year 4.37%. Gold down 0.3%, 2024 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.6%, 75.34 a barrel. Archer Daniels Midland shares are plunging 21% after ADM placed its chief financial officer on leave and cut its earnings outlook pending an investigation into the agricultural trading giant's accounting practices. The company says CFO Vikram Luthar has been put on administrative leave effective immediately. Again, ADM shares now down by 21.2%. Recapping, stocks are rallying. S&P up 15, up by about 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Where there's smoke, there's fire. The headline in the Union Leader as this great old newspaper endorses Nikki Haley on the Sunday before the primary. We're going to spend some time with the publisher of the Union Leader as I read in the op-ed. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Nikki Haley is our choice for the 24 First in the Nation primary, referring to Nikki Haley as an accountant by career and training, a mother, a military spouse, the child of immigrants, and one with the experience as a successful governor and diplomat. It's a pretty good story to tell if you're running for president. Brendan McQuaid thinks so. He wrote it. The New Hampshire Union Leader, president, publisher is with us here at the desk in New Hampshire. Thanks for having us in the Granite State. It's nice to see you.
Thanks for being here.
By all means. For our viewers on YouTube, we've got the Union Leader here because we love newspapers at Balance of Power. When this dropped on Sunday morning, this has always been a big moment in the New Hampshire primary. People were already moving on. When I look at the last line of this op-ed that you wrote, I'm compelled. New Hampshire can prove, you write, that the independent-minded voters of the Granite State will not be told the election is a done deal. I've been hearing this is over since I got here.
We've been hearing that it's over for about a year and a half, that it was a set thing. It was going to be Trump-Biden again.
Yeah.
That no one wanted it, but that's what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like that may come to pass, whatever people do. But our voters haven't had their say yet, and we think they deserve to.
But 50,000 people in Iowa essentially have brought us to this point.
Possibly, but you know, Iowa is a state of I think it's over 3 million people, and you're talking a tiny percentage of those 3 million people.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
So the Secretary of State earlier this hour told us that we could see record turnout tomorrow. Is that possible when there's a sense of inevitability like this?
It's certainly possible. We're encouraging people. I mean, I don't care if you like Trump, you want to write in Biden, you want to write in peace or ceasefire. We hope that people get out and vote and exercise their right. It's going to be a nice day tomorrow, so hopefully that'll get people out.
Yeah, you've got weather on your side, unlike Iowa.
Yeah, but I don't know. So many candidates having dropped out before New Hampshire means that there's a potential that some of those folks who were excited about candidates might not turn out.
I want to ask you about your conversations with Nikki Haley and what brought you to this point, but were you disappointed that Ron DeSantis bailed on the eve of the primary? His staff, from what I hear, actually thought he was here. They were manning events that never took place yesterday, and he was in Florida the whole time.
Yeah, we were talking with his campaign up until last week about having him in to talk to him.
He never sat down with you?
He never sat down with us, no. He was running an Iowa-heavy campaign, and I think that seems to be what showed him that it wasn't in the cards for him.
It seems like such an easy box to check. You go to the Union Leader, sit down for an ed board.
Yeah. I mean, we've never actually had an ed board. Common misconception. It's always been just sort of a group of us, but not a formal ed board, which is nice. We just sit down and have a conversation.
But you have to show up and talk to the paper.
Yeah.
Nikki Haley did.
She did.
What was that meeting like?
It was very nice.
Did you say, "Hey, we got one here," or was there a deliberation that followed?
Definitely a deliberation. Yeah, because at that time there were more candidates in the race. We still had several other candidates who have since dropped out, and we were, hoping to talk to more of them. But it was actually, I think, we had Chris Christie scheduled to come in Thursday morning, and he dropped out Wednesday night.
How about that?
Yeah.
So even Chris Christie didn't make it to the newsroom.
Yeah, and we endorsed him in 2016.
Yeah, and he was making a big New Hampshire play. I would think that might be the first stop he made.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, I'm guessing not this time, but he did sit down with you in 2016, right?
He did sit down with us in 2016, and he was the Donald Trump that we've all come to know over these past several years. A lot of energy, a lot of bravado. That's who Donald Trump has always been.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the choice for us, and we didn't think he was the right choice for New Hampshire or the country.
So then why Nikki Haley?
Why Nikki Haley?
Yeah.
Nikki Haley is the best candidate on paper and the best candidate in person that we've met in this cycle. She's got a ton of experience. She's a solid communicator, and she's, most importantly to me, she's a candidate of nuance, which you're featured in some of the TV commercials from
you saw that.
Mr. Trump that don't like nuance.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that's important for a leader to have that nuance and to understand that everything's not black and white.
It's interesting you mentioned that ad. They lifted part of our interview that was specific about raising the Social Security age or reforming the benefits somehow. She's the only candidate who went there. Was that part of your conversation? Did you have a sense that she had a plan to deal with entitlements?
Oh yeah, she's going to a couple of places. Entitlements are definitely one of them because that's part of one of the biggest issues facing this country, which is the debt and the deficit. But she's going there with that. She's going there with term limits, which is not a very popular thing among the folks in Congress that are all turning out to support various candidates. She goes there because she understands that these things are important.
She thinks candidates of a certain age should have a cognitive test. Do you?
I think maybe candidates of all age should have a cognitive test, but
you might be onto something there,
I think that I think it's a good punchline for her, but I think it is a valid point that she is a candidate that was born in the Vietnam era and not the World War II era.
It's a line from your endorsement. We cannot talk about Nikki Haley without addressing the elephant in the room, you say, and the rather old donkey hiding in the White House. I think I know who you're referring to. Nikki Haley, you write, is an opportunity to vote for a candidate rather than against those two. It's interesting. Were the other candidates all a protest vote?
No. I think it's just that Nikki Haley is one that you can definitely support. Chris Christie built a lot of his campaign on anti-Trump, which
a vote against Trump.
Some of the folks loved him for.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with most of the things that he was saying about Trump, but Nikki Haley is running her own campaign. It's not an anti-Trump campaign. And yes, it was Joe Biden we were talking about, who has moved from a basement campaign to a Rose Garden campaign, skipping New Hampshire entirely, which is just outrageous.
Well, I'm glad you went there. I talked to Annie Custer at this table the other day, and she's driving this write-in campaign for the President of the United States. I don't know if that's ever happened before, that a president has to get a write-in like this.
Yeah.
Okay, well, here we are. And I wonder how risky it is for him, knowing that Dean Phillips is out there beating the drum every day. Could we be in a world where Joe Biden gets less than 50%?
Or loses to a Dean Phillips
That's
who's
incredible.
actually here in the state and campaigning. It's possible. They're trying to save him from the embarrassment. Our editorial today points out that he deserves to be embarrassed. He deserves to be embarrassed for what he's done to democracy in killing the New Hampshire primary on the Democratic side, but also the Iowa caucus. I don't know if you've ever experienced the Democratic Iowa caucus, but it was a thing of beauty to watch these neighbors go one-on-one and convince each other when their candidate didn't have enough support to join another
There's no
team.
more crossing the gymnasium.
No. It's a remote sort of ballot fill in,
May as well be a primary.
and we'll know later sometime, and no one will care.
Well, so this is interesting. You say that He's doing damage to democracy. He says that he's turning his attention to a more diverse field, that New Hampshire doesn't represent the nation in its makeup, in its demographics. How do you answer that?
I was discussing this with someone over the weekend. If you look at New Hampshire, we're not a hugely racially diverse state.
They say it's an old white state. Let's say it out loud.
But we are incredibly diverse in terms of politics, in terms of thought, in terms of demographics of people, income levels all over the place, education levels all over the place. And the thing that really helps in the primary is that we allow our undeclared voters to vote for either party.
That's
They
right.
can choose either ballot.
So
and
will that result in a surprise?
I think it might. Those people are really hard to pin down. And I was talking to someone about the polls. The polls. Yeah. New Hampshire people love to mess with pollsters.
It's sport, correct?
Yeah.
I'm out of time, but I wonder your thoughts on an early call tomorrow night. Is AP going to step in before people are done voting at 8 o'clock?
I don't know. I hope not. I know that happened in Iowa.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a disservice whenever anyone does that. It's funny. They may call it for Donald Trump, who was aghast when that happened in 2020 against him. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this time.
I'm really glad you came by to see us.
Well,
we feel like it's important to be in New Hampshire, and as long as this contest is going on, we'll be here for it. It's great to meet you in person.
I'm glad you guys are here because many of your colleagues aren't.
Yes, indeed. Well, Bloomberg is on the ground, and it's great to have Brendan McQuaid with us from the Union Leader. Thanks for bringing the paper, and it's good to see you.
Sure thing.
I'm Joe Matthew in Manchester, New Hampshire, in a special edition of Balance of Power Radio. Let's get up to date on world and national news now. For that, we go to Washington. Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Joe. We may have skirted the most recent government shutdown deadline, but lawmakers face new deadlines in March, and that's forcing them to rearrange their schedules and move faster on negotiations. We got more from Bloomberg's Amy Morris.
Initial funding negotiations dragged for weeks, hung up on top-line allocations. Appropriations Subcommittee members are still waiting for their numbers so they can start negotiating the details of the bicameral bills. House members will come back early from their late February recess, which was supposed to last 2 weeks. Instead, they'll return February 28th, 2 days before the March 1st deadline. That extra day, courtesy of leap year. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
The defamation trial in which E. Jean Carroll is suing former President Trump has been postponed until tomorrow due to illness. One juror was apparently heading to court and began to feel flu-like symptoms, and Trump attorney Alina Habas says she was exposed to COVID but tested negative. She's still feeling under the weather. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyon.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing back to work Monday. Equities shaking off a rocky start to the new trading year. Amid conviction, the Federal Reserve will cut rates in 2024, and bets that the AI boom is poised to continue. Right now, stocks are keeping their upward momentum, with the S&P up 13, now at 48.53, a gain of 0.3%. Dow Industrials up 114, also up 0.3%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 57. That is a gain now of 0.4%. We are looking at a broad-based rally today, with the Russell 2000 gaining 1.5%, up now by 29 points. 10-year at 4.09%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.37%. Gold down 0.3%, $2,022 the ounce on spot gold, while West Texas Intermediate crude is up 2.5%, $75.27 a barrel. Bitcoin down 2.6% at 40,688. One of the big questions for markets is the timing of those Federal Reserve rate cuts. Seth Carpenter is chief global economist at Morgan Stanley, and on surveillance this morning, he told us he does not see a cut in March.
Inflation's coming down. It's coming down decisively. The economy is slowing, but in our view, not falling off a cliff. And so they're going to be taking a read on that macro outlook to figure out when to cut rates. Our baseline is June, but the market's sort of, in my view, a little bit over its skis, looking for, now a little bit less probability, less than half for March, but still high probability there. We think the data sort of pushed them off until June.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Alaska Air says it has begun inspecting door plugs in its Boeing 737-900 ERs several days ago, and says it does expect to complete the remainder without disrupting Alaska's flight operations. Meanwhile, Delta says it also took proactive measures to begin inspecting its 737-900 ERs. Right now, Alaska shares they're trading higher by 1%, Delta up 0.7%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 14, up 0.3. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
On the eve of the first in the nation primary, welcome to Manchester, New Hampshire, and Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, satellite and YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us. I'll tell you what, you don't go to New Hampshire without Rick and Jeannie. Not now or ever, and they're with me right now. Bloomberg Politics contributors, our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Great to see you guys in Manchester. We've got a lot to talk about here with a day to go. Rick, you must be having flashbacks here. Talk about momentum. Running up against someone who has more name recognition and maybe a better campaign. We talked to the publisher of the Union
with that
Leader.
better campaign.
Okay, I'll let you restate that. The stakes are so high for Nikki Haley, and we're hearing that this might already be over. I just wonder what's going through your mind and how different it feels this time.
Yeah, first of all, it's never over in New Hampshire till the balloting is in. It's a state that just loves to upset the apple cart. And I've been the beneficiary of that with John McCain twice. So speaking from some experience, they tend to like to poke the eye of the establishment. And in this case, Donald Trump is the establishment Republican Party. Even though he runs as an insurgent and he always wants to burn Washington down, he is the establishment of the Republican Party. So he comes in with a really big lead. It's one he's deserved. He's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of support. He's got a big campaign organization. But Nikki Haley really has started to fit into this role as the sort of come from behind, got a little momentum coming out of going into Iowa and then coming out of Iowa. She's had a little slow start getting started here in New Hampshire. She didn't hit it hard, but I feel like there is a lot of potential in what she's doing right now. And obviously, Ron DeSantis getting out yesterday really focuses the attention on a two-person race, something Donald Trump has never had.
How about that?
A two-person race.
Well, that's what Nikki Haley said it was coming out of Iowa. It turns out she was right. Is that a good thing for her? Because I keep hearing that those votes go to Donald Trump and that the timing here was awful.
They might. First of all, can I say I love Balance of Power at the noon hour. This is awesome.
Happy.
And you two look like you're twinning today, and I was left out of the game.
A morning memo here.
But I'm glad to be here. And
thank you, Jean. We're going to do this every day from now on, whether in Manchester or somewhere else.
I love it. I think for Nikki Haley, the challenge is going to be she really has to have a perfect day, starting in Dixville, Knox, at midnight tonight, and then throughout the day. She has no room for error at this point. She's going to have enormous turnout. They're even saying the Secretary of State's, 322 is probably not enough. She's going to have to be closer to the 340 that AFP is talking about. And she's going to have the independents and the moderates because, as we know, and Rick can tell us, you don't win New Hampshire without winning the independents and the moderates. So she's got what is it? I'm not a bowler. What is it? Bowl a perfect game. What's the saying? Something. I'm not good with the sport metaphors, but
it's candlepin.
You know how it is.
I think you're worried about that gutter ball.
That's true.
Yeah, which I always do. But so it's going to have to be a perfect night for Nikki Haley. If there's any state she can do it, it's here. And AFP really well organized on the ground. And she's got Governor Sununu, who you just talked to, in her pocket. So she's got several things going for her.
Let's look at some polls. We got a new pile today, Rick. Washington Post Monmouth poll: Trump 52, Haley 34. DeSantis was at 8 in this poll before he left. Nikki Haley's support has nearly doubled since November, thanks in part to Chris Christie votes. Still not enough, though. A huge enthusiasm gap as I look at this. Emerson, WHDH, Trump 53-37. It's almost identical. The Daily Suffolk Globe poll: Trump 57, Haley 38. It does make you wonder how a surprise could emerge.
Yeah, no, look, most pollsters will tell you get what you get in the polling, right? I mean, like whether it's the same numbers or the margins about the same and they mix it up a little bit. But yeah, you have to assume that right now this is a race that Nikki Haley has to upend. She has to do something. There's got to be a surge. As Jeannie was saying, people's models have to be wrong, where more people turn out or less people turn out affects those kind of margins. So, and we saw that in Iowa, where so few people turned out, almost half turned out, less than they did in 2016, and it really supercharged Donald Trump's numbers. So, yeah, she needs kind of a near miracle to get out of here with a win. But the reality is, she kind of already has a win. I mean, she was looking for a two-way race, head-to-head with Donald Trump, and she got it by virtue of DeSantis's withdrawal. And you can take a head-to-head contest all around the country because, there's nowhere that Donald Trump isn't just right around the cusp of 50%. And in a lot of proportional states, you can rack up a lot of delegates. You can't win coming in second place a lot, but you can extend the primary for quite some time
and make it a painful
see
convention.
what happens for Donald Trump.
That's right, knowing he might have an unpredictable year here. The president of the union leader sat at this table a moment ago, Jeannie, and said that New Hampshire loves lying to pollsters, messing with pollsters.
I hate to hear that as a pollster, but I think he's right.
But that's what we would need to have happen here, right? Either the sample's broken, like Rick said, or they just weren't honest.
Yeah, and another part of this is that there's a spiral of silence we talk about in polling where people, if you're a Republican, you may not feel comfortable telling a stranger who calls you for a poll that you're going against the most popular figure in the party. So something like that could happen. It's few and far between. If the polls are all wrong, polling has got a lot to explain, and so we will have to go back. We will have, egg on our face? Is that the famous saying? So we would have to be wildly wrong. But, I totally agree with Rick. This is a battle for delegates. So, she can, lose here and keep going. If she can keep increasing her delegate count, even if she doesn't win, and she can fight this thing, this is somebody with 91 counts against him. We don't know what's going to happen in these court cases. I'm not saying she's going to stay till the convention, but that delegate math is power for her. So she could fight this battle on, and she has won to the extent she is the last person standing beside Donald Trump.
Amazing that we're here with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. We'll talk about the flameout that was the Ron DeSantis campaign. What went wrong? Could that have been done better? Rick and Jeannie have more ahead on the fastest show in politics, Balance of Power. Bloomberg.
Now, your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellicott. Partnership with Dave Portnoy's Barstool Sports is powering shares of video platform Rumble higher. Investors flock to the company backed by billionaire Peter Thiel, driving shares up as much as 29%, adding some $400 million to its market value. It was the biggest intraday share move since the company began trading in September of 2022. And right now we do have shares of Rum moving higher now, up by about 21%. Gas station owner Sunoco has agreed to acquire pipeline and fuel storage company NewStar Energy for about $7.3 billion in a move to buy up more of a key part of its supply chain. Shares of Sunoco, they are advancing today. As for NewStar Energy, also moving higher on word of this transaction. Some of the other stories that we're following for you at this hour, right here on Balance of Power. Alaska Air says it began inspecting door plugs in its Boeing 737-900 ERs several days ago and says it does expect to complete the remainder without disrupting Alaska Airlines flight operations. Delta also says it took, quote, proactive measures to begin inspecting its 737-900 ERs, but so far has not commented on the results. Archer Daniels Midland shares are plunging after placing its chief financial officer on leave, and also it cut its earnings outlook pending an investigation into the agricultural giants accounting practices. ADM shares, they are lower now by 22%. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Manchester, New Hampshire on the eve of the primary. Kaylee Lyons will join the conversation in just 5 minutes. We'll have a few moments with our panel as well. After we get world and national news for that, we turn to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in New York. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Dozens of relatives of Israelis held hostage by Hamas are expressing their outrage. They stormed a parliamentary committee meeting today, yelling, "You won't sit here while they're dying there." This after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected what he said were unacceptable terms presented by Hamas for a new hostage deal. Bloomberg's Sylvia Westall says the pressure is building on the Israeli government.
The families, the hostages, have been holding regular rallies. They've been taking their concerns also around the world. They've been trying to keep this at the forefront. And it is something that's a domestic pressure. But at the same time, it's quite hard to overstate just how big a change, a shift in public opinion there's been in Israel as well.
Bloomberg's Sylvia Westall reporting from Dubai. Officially, 132 hostages remain in Gaza, though 27 are known to be dead. Elon Musk is once again responding to criticism that anti-Semitic content has gotten a boost since he bought Twitter and renamed it X. Speaking at a conference hosted by the European Jewish Association, the world's richest man said he sees almost no anti-Semitism in his social circles.
2/3 of my friends are Jewish. Okay. I have twice as many Jewish friends as non-Jewish friends. I'm like Jewish by association. I'm aspirationally Jewish. So I don't... I was like, what are people talking about with this anti-Semitism? Because I never hear it.
Elon Musk spoke with right-wing commentator Ben Shapiro at the EJA conference. Larry Summers, Harvard University's former president, has reignited his criticism of the institution by saying the co-chair of a new task force on anti-Semitism is unsuited to lead it. Summers said that Derek Penzler, a professor of Jewish history, has, quote, publicly minimized Harvard's anti-Semitism problem. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe.
All right, Nancy, thank you. I got the whole family around the table here as we head for hour 2 of Balance of Power, our experiment here in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm joined by, of course, our signature panel, Resetting with Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, and Kaylee Lyons has joined as well. Nice to see you here.
Hey, guys.
On the eve of the primary. We're talking about Ron DeSantis. It was around this time of day, Kaylee, yesterday. We were packing up to go to a Ron DeSantis event here in Manchester. His staff was too. Turns out he was in Florida.
Surprise.
Surprise, we're done, and we're endorsing Donald Trump. I've got to hear from the panel on this. Rick, this is being framed as an historic flameout. I don't think you had any expectations for Ron DeSantis going into this contest, but what could he have done differently with all of the money that he had to start a campaign with?
Yeah, $125 million spent, $3,500 per vote. Wow. That's a lot of money.
Yes.
So, look, I mean, at the end of the day, it was a pretty historic flameout where he started from to where he wound up. It's not the only flameout in American politics history, but it's certainly one of the more memorable ones. And he never connected with voters. He wasn't able to sustain the spend. He built a very big campaign that was burning up a lot of cash, and he wasn't getting the return on his money. So other donors just sort of went on to other people. And you can see the swollen coffers of Nikki Haley is what he was really hoping to get for himself. And I think we're going to learn a lot of lessons by this as to how not to run against Donald Trump. And this whole concept of embracing Trump while competing against him didn't work out very well for him.
Yeah. We only have 30 seconds, Jeannie. I would love for you to weigh in on this. How much of it had to do with his social awkwardness on the trail?
A lot of it did. You know, all of the things, the money, organization, everything, that can help. But the candidate has to be there and able to be a retail politician. He didn't have that test in Florida. He had it here. He's hoping he can learn some of those lessons for 28 now.
They'll be back next hour. Rick and Jeannie. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lyons.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Balance of Power.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Balance of Power. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself. Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons on Bloomberg Radio.
It's the eve of the first in the nation primary. And we're live in Manchester, New Hampshire on a special Balance of Power here on the radio. I'm Joe Matthew, along with Kaylee Lyons. It's just a matter of counting down and getting real votes now, Kaylee.
Absolutely. We are now just less than 24 hours away from people starting voting. But right now, Joe, we are not just on radio. We are also on Bloomberg Television.
How about that?
It is nice to see everyone. And for those of us who are just hearing us, it's nice to be talking at you.
That's correct. Yeah, we're going to be doing this every day here on Balance of Power at this time.
That's
as
right.
we bring the radio to the television and vice versa. And we have our signature panel with us. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano came to Manchester to figure out what in the world is going on here in a contest that, guys, I keep hearing could be the final stand for Nikki Haley. I hate talking about inevitability when we're here. People haven't even voted yet, Kaylee, but that does seem to be in the air. And Rick, I wonder if you find that to be fair before anybody's gone to a poll.
Yeah, no, I think it's understandable, right? Donald Trump was president of the United States. He's been the leader of the Republican Party since he was nominated in 2016. And so he's carried that off in a off-election year, you know, throughout the Biden administration so far in a way that seems like he's still president of the Republican Party. And so it's an odd thing to have a election around someone who had been an incumbent president, lost one election and back to try it again. So we've never really witnessed this. And I would say the thing I think we all agree with is the time we spent in Iowa and New Hampshire is there's a little less excitement about what's coming up on the election day tomorrow because the inevitability does hang out over top of this election, right? Who's going to knock this guy off his perch? It's a pretty high perch.
That's right.
And if he does get knocked off, that's a long fall.
And Jeannie, we got to check on the markets in just a second, but just quickly here, are we going to be in the general election beginning Wednesday morning? Is that what we're looking at?
That is what we're looking at if you believe the polls. New Hampshire always has surprises, so there may be a surprise tonight, and if she keeps it closer than the polls expect, that would be beating the expectation. But yeah, if the polls are right, we are in the general, and the Democrats, the Biden team, very happy about that, although I think they should be careful about celebrating too soon.
So we're talking about potentially the longest general election campaign in history.
Yes.
Is what we're signing up for here. Let that wash over you. As we turn to Wall Street here, we're going to have a conversation with Governor Chris Sununu, a very important voice here in this contest. After we get up to date on Wall Street, for that we turn to New York. Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. We are higher across the board right now, Joe Matthew, with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. S&P higher now by 10 points. That is a gain right now of 0.2%. Dow Industrials up 108, a gain now of 0.3%. We've got NASDAQ up 44, higher now by 0.3%. Stocks do remain higher after hitting a record last week. Strong economic data bolstering risk appetite, despite warnings that the market has run too far, too fast. 10-year yield 4.10% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.37%. Gold now down $8.50 the ounce to 2021, drop there of 0.4%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.6%, $75.35 for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, back to work Monday, an update. What about political backdrops and markets? Julian Emanuel is Chief Equity Strategist at Evercore ISI.
You can't ignore the politics. Obviously, the cycle will not allow you to ignore the politics. But from our perspective, again, if you look at the last several weeks, you have what you had once again, I think, back towards the summer of last year, the momentum trade really dominating all, and obviously generative AI.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. So again, recapping, stocks are pushing higher. S&P up another 10 now, up by 0.2%. Earnings season about to kick into high gear this week. Companies that will be reporting include Netflix, Tesla, and Intel, all reporting this week. Right now, Netflix up 0.5%, Tesla down 1.6%, Intel lower by 0.2%. S&P higher by 10, up 0.2, 10-year yield 4.10%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, we thank you. Back to Manchester here in New Hampshire, where we're waiting for actual voting to take place. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Balance of Power on the radio and on TV. We thank you for joining us. Kaylee, it's a great moment. We're going to do this every day from now on through the cycle, not just here in Manchester, New Hampshire, but also Washington, D.C.
And how lucky we are to have 2 hours of Balance of Power on both Bloomberg Television and radio, because it is a very important cycle, even if it's one, Joe, that frankly, we might not have seen one like it
That's for
before,
sure.
considering we are now in the second contest state, the first in the nation primary, and we were having a very realistic conversation as to whether or not the primary race actually ends come tomorrow.
Correct. The departure of Ron DeSantis late yesterday, which caught even his own staff by surprise, has many folks wondering if this is already over, whether Nikki Haley will make it to her home state of South Carolina, where currently Donald Trump holds a commanding lead.
And all of that to say, that is with the support of perhaps the most powerful surrogate she could have in the state of New Hampshire, the governor, Chris Sununu, who isn't just someone who has endorsed her, but has been next to her on almost every single campaign stop she has made in recent days, has talked to people like us, really tried to be her surrogate. And he's very popular here in New Hampshire, and it may not prove to be enough.
Not a fan of Donald Trump. He was going to work with the candidate he thought could defeat Trump here. It was the most sought-after endorsement in New Hampshire. And we sat down with him for an important conversation here, Kaylee. A pretty remarkable moment to hear from the governor, who's looking at the very same polls that we are, who knows what an uphill climb this will be for his candidate. We sat down here at the table to spend time now with Governor Chris Sununu. Let's listen. Iowa picks corn, New Hampshire picks presidents.
I know someone who created
You've heard that
line.
before.
Yeah.
You do. With that said, will New Hampshire pick the next president of the United States?
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. Look,
Obviously, I'm 110% behind Nikki. She's the one that's earning it on the ground. She's the one with all the momentum. Trump has his numbers. He's effectively the incumbent, but his numbers have been really stagnant. Nikki's the one that's been surging. She had a very good showing in Iowa. Right now, I think she just has to show that she's building on that here. If she can win, that'd be amazing, right? It doesn't have to happen. Carry that kind of momentum into South Carolina, into her home state with 3 or 4 weeks or something like that before the South Carolina primary even happens. And she obviously has a huge record of success running there. So, no, I'm very hopeful that this momentum is going to continue to build as we get into Super Tuesday.
But she's currently farther behind the former president in South Carolina than she is here in New Hampshire. So if she can't win here, how could she win there?
Well, no one's campaigned in South Carolina yet, right? So that should be expected. He's the incumbent. She hasn't been there and hasn't really put a campaign on the ground there. I mean, a little bit here and there, but it's Trump versus Haley. It is. So no one should be surprised because the conversation isn't happening on the ground there. As the conversation happened in Iowa, her numbers soared. As the conversation's happening in New Hampshire, her numbers soar. And as the conversation's going to happen in South Carolina, the sky's the limit for the former governor.
So winning New Hampshire is not necessarily required to win.
No, definitely. Were we saying back in November, December that New Hampshire was an absolute win, had to be an absolute win for someone other than Trump? No, no one's ever been saying that. I mean, recently Trump's trying to build that narrative effectively, but because he just wants to knock everyone out. But Nikki is the one that has knocked all these other candidates out of the race.
Well, you have said, though, a strong second could be in the offing. What does that look like? Define a strong second.
I think, again, just showing I think stronger performance than was in Iowa. That's the most important piece, right? And having less candidates in the race and defining it as a one-on-one race. But over the last few days, again, with the momentum, with the fact that she's doing the grassroots campaigning, she's going all across the state. She's engaging with voters every which way. Trump flies in, does a rally. They're not even very big rallies, actually, and then flies out of here. So he's kind of taking advantage of his role as the standard bearer, if you will, of the party for the last 7 years. But she's the one that's earning it. And again, her numbers are soaring and his are stagnant.
Well, but his numbers are roughly in the ballpark of about half of voters. He had more than half in Iowa.
Sure.
He's polling around half of voters in New Hampshire, the same ones that voted you into office on multiple occasions. If it's the conservatives in Iowa and moderates and independents in New Hampshire, and she can't get enough of either, what is the demographic that is supposed to elect her as president of the United States?
Well, again, let's start here. Imagine if you're the former president. In your own party, you can barely get 50% of the vote. That's why Trump's in trouble, right? So now that you have somebody new on the scene, kind of building that kind of momentum is huge. And the key is that it's a one-on-one race. So if Trump can barely hold 50% or keep him under 50% in a one-on-one race, well, the math says that there's 51% to Nikki Haley, and that's what you need to win a state. Now, I don't think any of these early states are must-wins for Haley. I don't think that's ever been the case. They're possible, but they're not must-wins. I think when you get to Super Tuesday, okay, now you really have to start winning states, obviously. But as long as she keeps building on that momentum, I think there's a lot of opportunity. She has money, she has resources, she has, knows how to win in New Hampshire, knows how to win in South Carolina. So all the wind is at her back.
Annie Custer sat in this chair a short time ago and said, we want you to write in Joe Biden. There's a write-in campaign for the president of the United States, which is remarkable. But she said, if not, vote for Nikki. Just don't vote for Trump. When you have a Democrat talking like this and Donald Trump across the street saying Democrats are infiltrating the process here to vote for Nikki
Democrats
Haley
cannot vote. Democrats cannot vote in New Hampshire.
Of course they
Well, you say, of course. I had other stations. I mean, you guys get it, but I had other stations being like, talking about Democrats vote. Democrats are not voting in the Republican primary at all.
But this idea that Democrat-leaning independents are going to make a difference here in New Hampshire, and there aren't enough New Hampshires to keep doing that across the country.
Yeah, well, independents have always been able to vote in our process, both Democrat and Republican. And they're not independents in New Hampshire. They're undeclared. Of course. So you can have hard Trump supporters and hard Bernie Sanders socialists within the undeclared spectrum. This year, they're more likely to play on the Republican side because there's nobody cares about the Democrat side. So that's all. So you're just going to see a lot more folks play there. And they tend to want change. That's it. They want the next new thing. They want, there's the Republicans that are within that independent group really are Republicans, right? They understand Trump doesn't carry Republican values. Was he fiscally conservative? No. He had tax cuts that supposedly helped the economy, but then borrowed $7 trillion to do it. That's like saying to your family, hey, look at this wonderful new house we're living in, and you just paid for it on a credit card, right? It's a falsehood. He doesn't believe in limited government. He believes in this kind of dictatorship. He doesn't believe in local control. He believes in Washington. So those are not Republican values. So I think a lot of the Republicans within that undeclared and those conservatives are very much coming over to Nikki's side.
Would it be fair, Governor, to say the Republican Party that Trump represents is not your Republican Party, not the Republican Party of your father?
Put it this way. I saw a bumper sticker the other day that says, "I don't vote Republican, I just vote Trump." He's his own. He doesn't define the Republican Party at all.
But you have said if he were to be the Republican nominee and because you are a Republican, you would support him.
Yeah, I think most people would. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Yeah.
Even though you don't think he actually carries the values of the Republican Party?
Well, look, Joe Biden, that's how bad Joe Biden is. I mean, I always say that. I mean, this is what has happened with inflation and all of that. The one thing I suppose that I'm hopeful, again, I'm hopeful it's Nikki. I think she can do it. Any Republican would build a much better team than Joe Biden. I mean, the team that Joe Biden has put in there, and with the rules and the regulations that are just crushing families, they're just crushing locals and state governments, and nothing can be developed, nothing can be built, nothing can move forward. So no, look, I'm excited about Nikki Haley being the nominee. That's why we're here in New Hampshire. This is where I don't want to say it all turns around, because she's already made the turnaround, right? It's already gone from 13 candidates to a one-on-one race. That in itself is amazing. This is where, again, she just keeps adding kind of gasoline to that fire and keeps driving forward.
You talk about Trump team building. Of course, most of Trump's team has come out against him following the administration. Many of them
That should tell you
fired
something.
on Twitter.
Yeah.
But so, you know, the quality of a team might only be as strong as long as you can keep it together. But I want to hear the argument, though. You're prepared to vote for Donald Trump if it's a Trump-Biden election. You've made that
According to
clear.
the polls, you know, most of America would. I mean, he beats Biden.
But
barely,
you're trying
by
to keep
1%.
that from happening.
Yeah.
Why is Nikki Haley, let's talk about your candidate, better for New Hampshire than Donald Trump?
So in the latest polls, New Hampshire hasn't gone Republican in the general election in about 20 years. And then the latest polls show that Trump gets crushed in New Hampshire against Biden. Nikki wins. Right. Nikki allows the Republicans in New Hampshire to win this state again in November. And that would happen in a lot of states across the country. So at the end of the day, you know, we can disagree on a policy here or there, but you got to win. You can't govern if you don't win. And Nikki not just beats Biden here in New Hampshire, but would beat him across the country.
It's interesting, though. You didn't reach for a policy. You just want to pick a winner, is your point.
Well, because you know what Nikki does? She makes sure that as I leave, we're going to get a Republican governor. And we're in Manchester right now. They should have a Republican congressman, but we haven't been able to win the seat, even though it's more Republican leaning. So because of that Trump brand, we've lost in 2018 and 2020. And 2022, I'm so tired of losing, and I'm tired of losers, and I think we're just tired of that brand that just drags the rest of the Republican Party down, right? What's the point of scraping out a win in the presidency if you lose everything else, like he has time and time and time again? So, you know, I want Republicans to win across the board. Nikki allows us to do that.
So do you think ultimately the biggest differentiator for you between the former president and Governor Ambassador Haley is not necessarily their policy differences, but their ability to execute on that policy?
You've hit it. So, Nikki, when you're governor, you don't get away with trying something and it doesn't happen and you just let it go. Healthcare reform didn't happen. Securing the border and building the wall didn't happen. Two of his biggest promises, right? Being fiscally responsible didn't happen. You know, decentralizing government, allowing states to have more control didn't happen. So, Nikki, as a governor, you're always held accountable. This is a 24/7 job for us. She goes in with that mentality. And, you know, she's going to manage the Senate. She's going to demand accountability. She's going to demand a balanced budget, right? She's going to demand that government at its core level just live up to its most basic expectations of getting something done and moving the ball forward. And she carries those conservative ideals to actually get it done. It's pretty cool.
Her closing argument, though, is that Donald Trump is a bully. He's too old. He's not cognitively well.
That starts the discussion. We could be here all day.
He'll bring chaos.
Yeah.
But to think that you would vote for him as the nominee, knowing that you'd be inviting all of that back, says a lot about where we are.
But remember, if you don't, in a binary race, if you don't vote for one, you're voting for the other. Okay. And I ain't voting for Joe Biden. I don't think anyone wants Joe Biden on
Joe Biden is that much worse than the chaos and the bullying that you framed, though, is what you're saying.
Does Joe Biden has to be let off a stage by his hand. God bless the guy. He's not there. There's no management. There's no sense of control. There's no sense of any of this at all. So, you know.
And you think it's about potentially the future team that a Trump administration, a second Trump administration could build. Should Nikki Haley be part of that team? Do you think it would be likely?
Look, I'm just focused on Nikki Haley winning the primary right now. I mean, really, what Nikki wants to do in the future, she could do anything. I mean, she's that amazing and that qualified. The focus right now is showing America that Republicans are looking at an alternative. They might not want an alternative out of Biden. That's going to be a problem for Democrats. But on the Republican side, we're actually giving a shot here. We're not just saying it's a fait accompli for Donald Trump. Nikki's surging. A lot of folks are galvanizing behind her. We're going to have record turnout here. I mean, think about Iowa, right? When people say, well, I guess it's over. Because 56,000 people in Iowa voted for Trump, that's like 2% of the population. 56,000 people are going to determine the pick of the Republican nomination in America? I don't think so. No. So you got to let this thing play out. I know the media just wants to call it. It's a good talking point. But you got to let this thing play out and make sure that the voters, not the media, not me, not Nikki, but the voters, that's democracy. Let them go to the polls and decide what's going to happen.
I wonder if the party's trying to call this, though. That Tim Scott endorsement, I realize endorsements don't mean a lot to a lot of people, but the timing was significant. He could have waited for that.
Nobody cares about Tim Scott.
South Carolina. Nobody cares about Tim Scott.
Nikki Haley doesn't care about Tim Scott. She appointed him to the Senate.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why the endorsement, right? So Tim Scott wouldn't be a senator without Nikki Haley. Right. That's why what he did was so disrespectful. Again, why? Because the Senate doesn't want to be held accountable. Nikki's going to hold government accountable. That's an amazing opportunity for America. Trump didn't do any of that, right? So, I found the whole thing, pretty disrespectful, but nobody really cares. He's a senator.
How about your future? You're happy you didn't run. And by that, I mean for president and Senate. You made that pretty clear. Look at what's going on there now. You could be in the middle of that.
Oh, sure.
What's next for you, though?
I don't know.
Are you looking at 28?
One thing, let me go back to Nikki a little bit. One thing Nikki and I both agree with, no, really, it's public service, not a public career, right? She wants term limits. And again, we don't have term limits in New Hampshire, but you self-impose them. You got to do the right thing. So you serve your state, or you serve your government, or you serve your community the best you can, and then you get back to
you go back in the private sector, or do you have an issues campaign that you might follow?
No. I'm just looking forward to get back into the private sector, and that's what everybody should do. Service. Then you get back to the private sector. You let new ideas and a new generation move forward.
But you're not taking 2028 fully off the table?
For myself?
Yeah.
No, I'm not running for anything in 28. I have no plans. No.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I don't mean to let you down. I'll still be on here. If you guys, maybe in a year, I'll send you a resume. Who knows?
That's for sure.
We'll take it up with our
Maybe you'll send Nikki Haley a resume. You think she's going to be the next president, don't you?
Oh, that would be awesome. I mean, it would be awesome, and she can do it.
You seem to be open to options, though.
Of course, I'm open to everything. Look, I do have a 24/7 job. I mean, I literally am governor as we're sitting here, and I will be governor for the next year. But there's a lot on the table. I'm a business guy. I'm an economics guy. I love that kind of stuff. I love helping businesses. I think businesses get way too involved in politics and that sort of thing. And I'm a big believer when you're selling a product, focus on selling the product. Don't get involved in the political wokeism and all that kind of garbage. So we've helped a few companies here and there with that.
Well, Governor, we do business and economics here as well. That's kind of our thing here at Bloomberg. And if you actually look at the economic data, if you look at how businesses are faring, you have the stock market at a record high. You have inflation on a downward trajectory, growth in the labor market still hanging in there. And I know you don't think that the Biden administration has been particularly successful, but is that not something that a future president and President Haley would want to replicate?
The most important data points are families. Let's look at national credit card debt. Let's look at what everybody owes, right? The spending that has gone on, not just with the government, but now with personal spending, and the fact that inflation is crushing folks. And this whole idea that the Fed is coming out and going to lower rates, I'm telling you, the piper has to be paid at some point. I think we are in store for an economic downturn. That's why I want an accountant like Nikki Haley to be president of the United States, because you need someone that can manage and understands these things at a fundamental issue. Donald Trump's economic policy is, I'll just keep borrowing money, and you guys will have to pay it back sometime to keep everything floating. And everyone gives him a pass on that. But at the end of the day, if you look at housing prices, if you look at the workforce issues that are happening across the country, limited services that are happening, the record high credit card debt, the fact that people are still struggling to put fuel in their homes, the fact that we're not energy dominant, which we should be, and Nikki wants us to bring it there.
The U.S. pumped a record amount of oil last year.
But we're not keeping up with what is needed. Yeah, you can pump a record amount, but again, if you're not keeping up with what is needed, you have supply chain issues that creates energy is at the heart of inflation. Inflation is created by one thing, right? Government prints and borrows too much money. That's it. That's all that causes inflation. But the second biggest issue around that is energy. We could be energy dominant, which allows products to go from A to B much quicker, products to be created a lot cheaper. And at the end of the day, inflation is the worst tax on low-income families you can imagine. Because a wealthy family can handle inflation. It might pinch us a little bit, but we'll be okay. Low-income families are getting crushed. They can't take their family to McDonald's for less than $35. That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. So it's those on-the-ground issues. Stock market, okay, fine. That could be inflated, whatever it might be. These kind of big-ticket items that might be talked about in the press. But go out there and talk to these families. They can't find housing. They're getting, because you can't build it. Why? Because it costs so much just to build housing. And when you do, it's $2,500 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. These are the kitchen table issues. Childcare. Nikki was at a childcare center this past week. Families can barely afford childcare, and one of the reasons is we can't find childcare workers. So again, you got to have the education system to create the infrastructure, if you will, for all these issues. So you can talk about big ticket items here, but what's happening on the ground in America right now is very, very different.
I know you've got a lot of families figuring out when to fill up the oil tank.
Right now, right here in New
degrees
Hampshire.
outside this morning. It's a very real thing.
People on fixed income. You know, let's talk about the Social Security issue. Social Security is going bankrupt. By law, there is a 22%, 23% cut in benefits coming in about 10 years. That's in the law. Trump says I will do nothing to stop it, right? I'm not going to stop it. Nikki's the only one that has a way to stop the benefits from being cut and allowing everyone to keep the benefits that they've been promised. But she's the only one willing to engage on that issue. That's a huge issue. If you're a senior, you should be scared to death that Donald Trump
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's an ad running that the Trump campaign has that's got my face in it talking to Nikki Haley about Social Security. It's remarkable. The claims in the ad go far beyond what she said. This is a big deal for an aging population in New Hampshire, never mind the rest of the country. Does she need to put a finer point on that policy and say this will be the age, and this is what we're going to tell 21-year-olds or 20-year-olds when it comes time for them to start
Sure. So look, I think she's been talking about it. I think, again, the Trump ads and all the negativity and the lies and everything, he just says whatever he wants to say just to bash on Nikki. But at the end of the day, it's his complacency on Social Security that allows it to go bankrupt. He's effectively acknowledged it. And that cut is coming. And again, if you're a senior, you should be scared to death that you'd be potentially getting behind Donald Trump when he says the cuts are coming and there's nothing you can do about it.
He has that in common with Joe Biden, doesn't he?
That's right. They're both hands off.
Security.
But it is going bankrupt. This isn't like, oh, it might not. It is going bankrupt. The cuts are coming. Someone like Nikki Haley has to get in there to show how to maintain those benefits, maintain those services for the elderly, and again, allow the system to be solvent once again. It can be done. It's just good math, and again, it's also holding Congress accountable so they do their job as well.
Maybe you should have run. You could have brought that issue to Governor Chris Sununu with us here at the table in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. A tour de force conversation there, Kaylee. We covered a lot of ground in a conversation that you're not going to hear anywhere else, which is why it was featured today in the Boston Globe and the New York Times. Really fascinating to try to get inside his head and understand his real expectations. I don't know how you quantify a strong second.
He didn't seem to want to get specific with what a strong second would mean either. I just thought it was so interesting to hear him tell us, after all of the hype about New Hampshire being Nikki Haley's best chance to upset the front runner, to say that she doesn't have to win here.
Isn't that something?
And I just wonder if that is an argument that Rick and Jeannie also buy.
Yeah, let's bring the panel back in. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with us at the table here. What's your thought on that, Jeannie? We're really gaming expectations now, although it's hard to even really figure out, as we just heard, where the governor sets the bar.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was just thinking, watching your interview, gosh, remember when we thought he might run? And that is an example as to why so many Republicans. He's glad he didn't. I think some Republicans wish he did. You know, it is so hard. I think looking at those polls, he wants to lower expectations so that she can at least meet them. You know, I've heard people say everything from 3 to 7 points she can lose by. But, you know, my view has always been winning New Hampshire is losing for Nikki Haley, because Donald Trump has successfully, I think, made her the poster child of the never Trumpers. He talks about her as the candidate of the globalists, the candidates of the media, the candidate of the Democrats. A vote for her is a vote for Joe Biden. So even if she was to, you know, just beat expectations and win, he is going to make it really, really difficult for her to go down to South Carolina with those demographics and to really push this thing through.
So, Rick, is this a lose-lose situation for Nikki Haley?
No, I think she could only win, right? I mean, look, she's got it down to a two-person race. There is a ticket out of New Hampshire, regardless if you beat Donald Trump. And remember, he's won one caucus with 50,000 people. That does not speak for the entire Republican Party, including independents and non-aligneds who do participate as Republicans here in New Hampshire. And so the thing that I always get a kick out of is Donald Trump makes a big deal about this issue of Nikki having independent support here, but he does too. He has 38% of his ballot. That 50% is contributed by 38% independent voters. So look, these are the rules of the road. Everybody knows it when they sign in to run here, and it's historically always been a factor. As much as 40%, maybe more this time, of the vote tomorrow will be these unaligned voters who become Republicans at least for the day. And that's what a good recruiting mechanism.
Just quickly, we're going to hear from Congresswoman Annie Kuster in just a moment. Jeannie's talking about lowering expectations. You've been part of this before. Is that what you do on the eve of her winning? You try to make this look like a bigger deal than it would be otherwise? Do they think they're going to win and they're telling us a strong second?
Yeah, there's great participation in both the media and the campaign on expectation. Media want to create high expectations. Look, you got to really knock the ball over the fence. She's like, no, I can get to second base, and that's a win for me. So, there's a lot of work in the ref today.
Good. We're going to stick with Rick and Jeannie because I want to hear from you what the Democrats are doing or not doing. We haven't even mentioned Dean Phillips yet. And it's a conversation we had with Congresswoman Annie Kuster, Democrat here in New Hampshire from the 2nd District, who's driving a write-in campaign for the president after the DNC got in this confused mess as the president put South Carolina ahead in the line. Here's Congresswoman Annie Kuster.
We want to make sure that when voters turn out on Tuesday, that they know they can write in Joe Biden's name, just go to the bottom of the ballot. Luckily, it's easy to spell. And they can vote for Joe Biden in the first presidential primary here in New Hampshire.
Are you setting expectations on a turnout for Joe Biden? Do you need to reach a certain threshold? What if he gets 60%? Is that a bad look?
Well, here's the thing. I want to make sure he wins, but I think it's going to be impressive, and I think it's going to send him into the next contest and into this primary season with a strong foundation. I want to make sure that people understand we support Joe Biden for a second term. We're proud of the work that he's done domestically, and we're very grateful for his leadership on the world stage.
So you're making a statement here. Your delegates must be frustrated, though. Will you make an effort to recognize your delegates at the convention when Democrats meet later this year?
Sure. I think if it goes well on Tuesday, that won't be any problem at all. We've been through this before. Other contests have about whether their delegates will be seated. Look, most New Hampshire voters and even the most engaged people who have been through many, many campaigns, I've been doing this since I was 16 years old. We're not hung up on delegate selection and all of that. We want to make sure that the voters are heard. And part of the history of the New Hampshire primary is that it came into being so that voters could speak directly on their preference for president and not have these decisions be made in backdoor business rooms where, pundits get together and make these choices.
Would have been nice for the president to make a visit, maybe hold a rally or something, wouldn't it?
Well, I have to laugh. We've had, I think we're up to 10 cabinet visits in the last month or so, 4 last week. So I think they're here in spirit.
So that's what you're trying to accomplish. What's Dean Phillips trying to accomplish? Have you spoken to him? Has he asked you for your support?
He's asked me for my advice. I told him I thought it was ill-advised, not well-timed. He got in on literally the very last day. And frankly, and I mean this kindly, I think it's unimpressive in terms of the campaign that he put together. As I said, I've been doing this for 50 years. I've seen what it takes. I was in on the ground floor with Barack Obama. He used to say I was on board before Michelle was on board. And I've seen what it looks like to do dozens of house parties and town hall meetings and build that grassroots campaign that's going to deliver the vote on Tuesday.
He says he grew up here, even learned how to shoot guns as a kid in New Hampshire. What doesn't he understand about the Granite State?
I don't think he understands much. I think that what he's missing is that, like other parts of the country, we care to learn and vet a candidate, and he really hasn't put in the time or build the support. We turn to our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues to see who is getting support. You're watching this now on the Republican side with Nikki Haley, with our governor, Chris Sununu. We care a lot about who are the surrogates that are getting behind these candidates, and I don't think he's built the support that would be a substantial campaign, a serious campaign.
I don't know if you heard Donald Trump last night. He says Democrats are going to vote in this primary to infiltrate the process. That is, of course, not possible.
Not possible.
Do you wish he was right?
Well, look, I think there are many undeclared voters, we call them here in New Hampshire.
Yes.
They're not registered Democrat or Republican. They're making the decision right now whether to take a Democratic ballot and write in Joe Biden or whether to take a Republican ballot and vote for Nikki Haley. But the message that they're delivering is the same on Tuesday. New Hampshire voters do not want Donald Trump to have a second term. They think that he's not fit to be the president of the United States again.
That's fascinating. So you're comfortable with people doing either, as long as
I
it's not
think
Trump?
people should do what they feel most comfortable doing. I voted for Joe Biden, and I'm encouraging people to support Joe Biden for a second term. But there will be people who will choose to vote in the Republican primary to deliver that message, that anti-Trump message, by voting for Nikki Haley. And, you know, one part of this story that they understand very well, I was one of the last people evacuated from the Capitol on January 6, 2021.
Yeah.
And they've heard this story, and 3 weeks ago they saw the video footage that it was only 30 seconds from when I was evacuated to when those insurrectionists are in that hallway hunting for us, trying to disrupt the election. And New Hampshire voters know full well that it was Donald Trump that instigated that attack on our government and that was trying to overturn the results of the election. So I think the sentiment is very strong, and I hope the message will be sent on both sides of the ticket that Donald Trump is not fit for another term.
Congresswoman Annie Custer, the Democrat from New Hampshire, talking with us here on Bloomberg Balance of Power in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew, and a quick swing here from Jeannie Shanzano. As a Democrat, is Dean Phillips the spoiler, the problem that she frames him, or should more Democrats have run?
You know, there's 21 people on this ballot, including our old favorite paperboy love Prince, who's not there, Joe Biden.
I just saw him out in the hallway.
We love him. But you know, Joe Biden, it's a write-in. That's tough to win. I think Joe Biden is running this Rose Garden strategy. He really needs to get out there. Bernie Sanders is right. Face the economic challenges people are confronting in New Hampshire and elsewhere.
Is this risky, though? What if, like we just said, what if Dean Phillips beats the president because of this hokey write-in campaign?
Yeah, I mean, Dean Phillips has a shot, but he's not going to go anywhere out of this except maybe to no labels.
Well, we're going to talk to Dean Phillips this afternoon.
That's going to be an interesting conversation. Of course, the president's looking forward to South Carolina. We're going to talk to Jim Clyburn as well about this sort of confusing moment for Democrats here in the first in the nation primary state. A lot more to follow here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and we begin with a developing story. Just getting word that Dexter Scott King, the younger son of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, has died after battling prostate cancer. The King Center in Atlanta says the 62-year-old son of the civil rights leader died today at his home in California. Dexter Scott King dead at the age of 62. An up day for Wall Street. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all building on records. S&P up 9 right now, gain of 0.2%. Dow Industrials up 71, up 0.2%. NASDAQ up 38, up 0.2%. 10-year yield right now 4.10%. We have got the 2-year yielding 4.38%. Spot gold right now down $8 the ounce, lower by 0.4%, while West Texas Intermediate crude is up 3%, 75.63 a barrel. The index of leading economic indicators continues to signal weakness. More from Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The data have been in the red since April 2022, just after the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates. December's leading indicators notched another loss, a loss of 0.1%. Factory orders and consumer sentiment accounted for the bulk of the weakness in the Conference Board's report. On Thursday, the government issues data on fourth quarter economic growth, and Wall Street anticipates moderation. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu was weighing in on the economy, specifically the odds of a recession, here on Balance of Power.
Let's look at national credit card debt. Let's look at what everybody owes, right? The spending that has gone on, not just with the government, but now with personal spending, and the fact that inflation is crushing folks. And this whole idea that the Fed is coming out and going to lower rates, I'm telling you, the piper has to be paid at some point. I think we are in store for an economic downturn.
And you can hear more of that conversation right here on Balance of Power on our podcast. Again, recapping, 10-year yield 4.10%. We've got the S&P higher by 10, a gain right now of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the first in the nation primary state. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew, live in Manchester alongside Kaylee Lines. As we try to figure out what's going to happen 24 hours from now, Kaylee, a big raft of polls dropped this morning. And It's not just the spread that we're looking at. It's the incredible consistency between these polls. Gregory Cordy made the point earlier in the broadcast that this die seems to have been cast months ago. We haven't seen much motion, certainly since Chris Christie dropped out of the race. The thought being that this might look like the way the results do tomorrow.
Well, even the polling that was showing Haley in single digits behind former President Trump just weeks ago, CNN, for example, is now showing her double digits.
That's important.
Behind him. 19-point spread in the Suffolk University Boston Globe poll, 18-point spread when it comes to Monmouth and the Washington Post. And in the latest Emerson College polling that came out yesterday, Joe, 50% plan to support Trump, 35% support Nikki Haley, and then 8% support Ron DeSantis, who, of course, as of yesterday afternoon, is no longer in this race as he dropped and endorsed Trump.
And so was that the worst timing ever is a question for Nikki Haley supporters, because those votes aren't going to Nikki. They're going to Trump from the DeSantis camp.
So goes the thinking. But let's get the opinion now of Spencer Kimball, the Emerson College polling director. So as I said, Spencer, thank you so much for joining us here in Manchester in our studio. 8% support for Ron DeSantis. Where does that 8% go?
So that conventional wisdom is that he's in the same lane as Trump, and he'll go into Trump's lane. But our polling indicates that those voters are more split. There was a reason why they weren't voting for Trump, and they were voting for DeSantis. And it looks like about 45% would actually vote for Haley, and she might actually pick up a few votes there. Remember, when Christie dropped out of the race, she didn't pick up all 12 of those points. She only picked up 6 or 7. And so same thing will probably happen with the DeSantis vote.
What's it like as a pollster when you settle on your numbers and you look around, you see everyone else got almost the same numbers? This is pretty unusual.
It is. Usually you see a range of scores with our polls, and then it's going to fall within that range. But we kind of saw this happening in Iowa as well. These numbers were all baked together in that low 50s, and that's what we saw with Trump. A little bit of a surprise with DeSantis. We'll see here in New Hampshire, we're also seeing Trump in that low 50s. If those numbers hold, or where those undecideds break for Haley potentially making it a little closer.
Well, in New Hampshire, consistently is a surprise. It's just a question of whether or not everybody's going to be surprised this time around when it seems that everyone feels an inevitability of Trump ultimately, if not outright winning the state. It's going to be very tight, and ultimately it seems, according to everyone Joe and I have talked to here in recent days, that everybody presumes he's going to be the Republican nominee. And part of that is not just the way that he's polling in terms of the headline figures of how much support he has, it's the enthusiasm of the people who say they are voting for him. What have you seen in your data on that?
Yeah, so we ask voters, what's the chances you're going to change your mind or you're going to stick with your candidate? And the Trump vote has been between 75 and 90% sticking with Trump. Right now it's at 90. Back in August, it was at 75. So it's only been growing. Haley, on the other hand, she's at 80% now, but she was at 50. So her vote has locked in over the last couple of weeks. DeSantis, we saw his numbers drop. His voters were locked in, and in our last poll, we saw 50% were like, hey, we might switch. And I bet you the governor saw that as well and decided maybe it's time to get out of this.
We've learned, and this is from a Monmouth poll out today, you might have found this very same thing, Spencer. 47% of potential Republican primary voters are not registered Republicans. This is the strange, mysterious independent voter that we keep hearing about. 47% of potential Republican primary voters. What does that mean for Nikki Haley in terms of a potential surprise tomorrow?
She needs more. She needs 60% independent votes because she's losing the Republicans. So these are registered independents. In New Hampshire, they're called undeclared.
Undeclareds.
And we have registered Republicans. Normally in a party primary, 60% are Republicans, 40% will be independents. And what we're seeing here is more of a 55-45. What she needs is to flip the script and get actually a larger percentage of independents to come out, like 60%, and only have 40% of Republicans vote in this primary.
So high turnout may be what she needs here if she's going to eke something out. And it's just a question of how high that turnout will be.
The Secretary of State told us we'd have a record, which I don't understand walking around Manchester right now.
Yeah, it feels quieter than at least I would have anticipated. Joe really hyped it up to me before we came here.
I told this whole story about the carnival that comes with the New Hampshire primary. We can't get arrested out on Elm Street.
I agree. It's a different atmosphere this time around than I've seen in my 20 years of studying these elections. But remember, New Hampshire takes their primary very seriously. And the Democrats have moved away from being first in the nation. And the reason why they might come out is to make the statement that they want to stay first. Remember, 2028 is coming. Are they going to stay first in the nation, or are they going to lose out to South Carolina? So that's the reason I think you could see a tremendous turnout, is more in the pride of their state. And you'll see it on the Democratic side as well, even though there's really not a contest.
Well, and we know that voters in New Hampshire like to hear from these candidates as much as they possibly can. They could have heard more from Nikki Haley had she actually decided to partake in debates this week, which she did not. Is that having an impact on how she's polling as we really approach the end game here?
Well, we were thinking the same thing, and so we asked the voters, what do you think about her skipping the debates? And for 75%, they said it didn't matter. Now, we asked them about Trump skipping all of the debates, and for 60% of them, it didn't matter. And for the ones that it mattered, they're kind of split. I was thinking you got to debate just for a game changer. You came out of Iowa without that momentum. You needed some sort of focusing event during this week, and she didn't really have that. And unfortunately, in her campaign, the focusing event seemed to be the endorsements of Trump by some of her opponents.
Tim Scott,
and you know, he got DeSantis, and so that's not what she needed to go into the primary. We'll see if it plays out for her, though.
Well, Spencer, you've done a great job here at Emerson. I went to Emerson College way before there was a polling institute there, and you've really put yourself on the map here in a great way. You do great work, and we've really enjoyed following the data. Are you ready for the longest general election campaign of your life?
Well, yes. We're looking forward to studying the election. But remember, we got primaries in Ohio and California. There's other races. There's a New York 3rd District race that people are interested in. So, yes, we have presidential primary politics, but we'll keep an eye out.
For that reason, we would love to stay in touch with you even beyond New Hampshire, and I appreciate you being with us today.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you.
Stuff. Spencer Kimball with us from Emerson College polling. These numbers look pretty stubborn right now, Kaylee.
Yeah, and they don't look great if you're Nikki Haley or her supporters. And limited times to change minds here, Joe. If
you said it.
The polls open in just about 16 short hours from now.
Stay with us here on Bloomberg. We're live in Manchester. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons on Bloomberg Radio.
As we carry on live from Manchester, New Hampshire, counting down to the start of voting, which will be 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, East Coast time. Kaylee, the closings are a little bit different with staggered finishes. There's 7, there's 8, and there are great expectations for an early call. We'll find out together tomorrow.
Well, we certainly got one in Iowa. Half an hour after the caucuses began, it was called for Donald Trump. So we'll see if the Associated Press and other networks are feeling as bold this time around. But given how polling is suggesting at this point, we could see another 50% plus potentially for the former president. That said, Nikki Haley is trying to shoot her shot here. She's still out campaigning, as is her most powerful surrogate here, perhaps, Joe, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu.
That was quite a conversation.
We had an extensive conversation with him yesterday, not just about Nikki Haley, but also about the economy, because he says, you know, I talk business, I talk economics. We've got stocks at a fresh record high today. And I said, isn't that something any president would want? And he said it's not about the stock market. He's looking at other things. Here's a little taste of what he told us.
Let's look at national credit card debt. Let's look at what everybody owes, right? The spending that has gone on, not just with the government, but now with personal spending, and the fact that inflation is crushing folks. And this whole idea that the Fed is coming out and going to lower rates, I'm telling you, the piper has to be paid at some point. I think we are in store for an economic downturn.
So interesting to hear him tell us that yesterday, Governor Chris Sununu, when pretty much everyone seems to be talking a soft
he
landing.
didn't use the
Joe.
R word. I mean,
No,
downturn, is that
downturn.
what we're talking here?
Yes.
Of course, he's been running around talking to folks, as we discussed here in New Hampshire, many of whom have a paycheck-to-paycheck lifestyle, and they have to fill the tank. Outside of the Northeast, that's pretty unusual, but heating oil is a big factor for these old homes, and it costs hundreds of dollars to fill the tank. And around this time of year, you're trying to figure out how much you need and what the weather might be like, whether you're going to buy something that lasts you until spring. And this is what he hears about when he goes to the diner.
And that's probably a very different conversation than the one we often have here at Bloomberg about the strength of economic indicators. Not everyone is looking at University of Michigan consumer sentiment and the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, PCE deflator. But I know Carol Massar and Tim Stenovic do because, well, this is Bloomberg, and Bloomberg Business Week is about to take the baton from us here in Manchester. Carol and Tim are in New York. Guys, what did you make of Governor Chris Sununu thinking there still is a downturn ahead, despite what we hear so often in recent months?
Well, I think it's the big debate, right? And whether or not the Fed policy ultimately gets it right. We've talked so much about this soft landing that we think we are in, yet it gets tricky as we get near the end. We've got a great voice coming up on this. Bill Dudley, the former president of the New York Fed, he was there, coming out of the financial crisis, had to deal with a lot. So I'm just curious to see if there's like some concerns, Tim, that he has on his radar, or whether he's pretty comfortable with this soft landing scenario.
Yeah, Hey, I do think
we've got to remember too.
Go ahead.
Well, we got to remember we're hearing from Republicans on this. In this case, it would benefit a Republican to project a downturn in the economy.
Yes,
Tim, if there is a soft landing, that would be remarkable timing for Joe Biden to tell that story going into an election.
It would be, but as the polls have shown, the message that he's been trying to spread has not gotten across to voters. I was going to say the governor's remarks to you kind of reflected what much of the polling, at least that Bloomberg has done in the swing states over the past few months, has reflected that even though by all measures the economy looks really, really good, consumers just don't feel that way, and they're saying that in the polling and supporting the former president as a result.
Yeah, Chris Sununu tried to get to that point, and it gets to the point of not just slowing inflation, Kaylee. They want to see deflation. They're still paying more than they were in 2019, and that's the narrative going into this election.
And deflation is a whole different ballgame. That is not what the Federal Reserve is trying to engineer. They want 2%, which is still prices moving higher, which may be not welcome news to the average American voter.
Yeah, how true. So I don't know, guys. It's amazing to be on with you here. We're going to do this on the daily from now on as we shake hands between these two great shows, Balance of Power and Bloomberg Business Week. And there's a remarkable amount of crossover, as we're, I think, pointing out right now, between politics and business. And I wish you guys were here with us. I haven't even seen Vermin Supreme running around with a boot on his head. We're wondering why the primary is so quiet. We could use Tim and Carol.
Are they let you inside this time, guys? That you don't have to stand outside in the snow?
Yes.
All day today and tomorrow? You're okay?
Yes.
No, we have heat, and even if we didn't, we'd still be grateful after Iowa. We're 35 degrees warmer than we were last week. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, we were up at the old snowshoe club last night.
Yes, we were.
Which is a barn, essentially, in the middle of a field. They had the fireplaces roaring, and it was really something to hear from folks who have been doing this for generations.
Yes.
There were a lot of them Nikki Haley supporters, not really feeling the momentum here. There was a sense of resignation as they were pouring bourbon late into the night.
This idea that it's inevitable that former President Trump is going to be the nominee. Of course, that is not set in stone yet. We do still have the primary tomorrow, guys.
Thank you for reminding everyone that a vote has not been cast yet.
Votes have not been cast.
Yeah.
They start at midnight.
That's right.
It's
if you want to
legendary.
stay up late, go to Dixville Notch. We'll see what the 7 people up there have to say, and we'll pretend that that's an indicator for tomorrow. The surprise, if there is one, will probably come around 8 o'clock tomorrow night.
That's right.
And what we expect could be an early call. 8:01 is when you want to be listening. We'll be live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. All right, Carol and Tim have a lot more to follow here on Bloomberg Business Week. I'll meet you back here at 5 o'clock on the next edition of Balance of Power.
We got 2 hours every day on both television and radio.
Yep, with some great conversations. Thanks to Governor Sununu for having us here in his house, as it were, in a great conversation with the Gov. We'll have much more to follow here, including a conversation with Dean Phillips.
Yes, there's Democrats in this game too, don't you forget.
You said it. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. Bloomberg Business Week starts.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to everybody now joining us on Bloomberg TV. Welcome into our Bloomberg Radio studio here at Bloomberg headquarters. We're on radio, TV, YouTube, and of course our streaming service, Bloomberg Originals. I'm Carol Master along with Tim Stenevec. And let's get to the setup at this hour because, you know, it feels like the risk trade is on, although we're off our highs of the session here.
Yeah, U.S. stock continuing to build on their record high. This is 2/3 of Bloomberg Markets Live Pulse responded saying that betting on early monetary easing is the, quote, most foolish among popular trades heading into 2024.
And I got to say, Tim, we've got a perfect guest to address this on this Monday. We've got the former president of the New York Fed, Bill Dudley. He has seen a lot, certainly during his tenure at the New York Federal Reserve. So we're curious to see what he has to say in terms of a rate cut, or could we get another rate increase? We've got a lot to talk to him about.
Also, two stocks on our radar this afternoon. The ag giant ADM shares dropping after its CFO is placed on leave. A cut to its earnings outlook and delays fourth quarter earnings and filing its annual report amid an accounting investigation. That's the bad news, but there's also some good news out there.
Well, we want to get to that, but we do have a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal. The Fed Inspector General issuing its report on two former members of the Federal Reserve System, and we're talking about Boston Fed Chief Eric Rosengren and also Dallas President Robert Kaplan. Remember, they stepped down in September of 2021, so we're getting that report crossing. Having said that, let's bring in Bloomberg's Mike McKee, because he's also seeing these headlines as they cross.
Well, I've just been reading the report, and according to the Inspector General, with regard to Mr. Kaplan, he says, we did not find that his trading activities violated laws, rules, regulations, or policies related to trading activities. His 2020 Form A Federal Reserve Bank Confidential Financial Disclosure Report did not publicly disclose the specific dates of his trading activities, nor did it specify transactions that involved the selling of stock option contracts. And that lack of information, in the Inspector General's opinion, did not support public confidence in the impartiality and integrity of the policymakers. As far as Eric Rosengren, the Inspector General found that he did not report multiple trades on his 2020 Form A. Additionally, they found multiple discrepancies between the transactions reflected in his brokerage statements and trading data and what he reported on that Form A. Moreover, in the Inspector General's opinion, they say, Mr. Rosengren's trading activities in real estate investment trusts during a time of financial market volatility that prompted the Federal Reserve to authorize the purchase of agency mortgage-backed securities created a, quote, appearance of a conflict of interest that could cause a reasonable person to question Mr. Rosengren's impartiality under the Federal Reserve Board's Code of Conduct. They go on to say that the rules in effect at the time did not sufficiently support confidence in the impartiality and integrity of the policymakers. Those rules have been changed.
So net, Mike, I know this is just your first reaction, but was it a conflict of interest or merely an appearance of a conflict of interest? What's the report say?
It's hard to say exactly with regard to Eric Rosengren, because it sounds like there may have been a conflict of interest, but the Inspector General does not highlight the fact that there is one, but it could appear that way. In Kaplan's case, there wasn't a conflict of interest, and he didn't violate the rules, but the fact that he didn't completely dot every I and cross every T suggests that it could have had an impact on how people think about the Fed. And that's kind of what this report, I think, is going to be saying when you read it all. It's 24 pages. I'll get to it. but basically,
not if we can help it.
Basically, it's a question of, can you trust the Fed? And that this seems to sort of say there were problems.
Well, and we have a great voice on this. Former New York Fed President Bill Dudley is with us. He's also, of course, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist. Bill is joining us on Zoom in New York. Bill, so great to have you here across our Bloomberg platforms. Can we trust the Fed based on what the Inspector General, the report that they just released? Do you feel confident about the U.S. Central Bank?
Yes, I do. I think the change in procedures as far as reporting and trading, what you're allowed to do from a trading perspective, that's been tightened up considerably in light of what happened. And I think that the regime today is, far better than what we had before.
Bill, how damaging overall over the last couple of years was this to the Federal Reserve, or at least the appearance of the Federal Reserve?
Well, I mean, anything that calls into question the impartiality of the Fed, or the idea that the Fed was somehow people were trading on information that wasn't public, obviously that's terrible. The good thing is it sounds like this report, which I haven't had a chance yet to read, sounds like that there were no actual violations of rules and regulations. But certainly the appearance of a conflict is a bad thing because it can undercut the credibility of the central bank.
Bill, Mike McKee here. I'm just wondering if you felt at the time, if anybody felt at the time that either President Rosengren or President Kaplan had done anything wrong. The stories we have at the time suggested there was no pressure from the Federal Reserve for them to resign, but was it the right thing for them to do?
I'm not going to opine on that. What I will opine on is that you need to have a regime in place that creates confidence in the Federal Reserve System, and that regime needs to be robust. I think the thing that's sort of remarkable about this, frankly, is how long it's taken for the Inspector General to come out with these findings. I mean, it seems to me like this was something that could have been expedited much more quickly. So I'm not really sure why this took so long to become public.
That's a fair question. I also do wonder, is it a fair question to say, or fair kind of assessment to say, this should never have happened, this should have never even been a concern or cause for worry, Bill?
Well, I think there's always, with the benefit of hindsight, everything, looks obvious. I'll give you an example. When I was the president of the New York Fed, or when I was the head of the markets group at the New York Fed, there were very few restrictions on the trading activities of people within the bank, and you couldn't do things around FOMC meetings, but people were in possession of non-public information at other times, and the regime just wasn't very robust. And so when I became president, I changed that. I put in a much tougher regime because I didn't think that the regime that we had in place was robust to. People were, behaving on their own, but you want something, you want governance and control above that.
I think the key headline here at the bottom line is that, according to the Inspector General, Rob Kaplan and Eric Rosengren did not do anything legally wrong. So it's more of an appearance of a conflict. Now, we also had issues at the same time with Jay Powell and Richard Clarida. Is that, do you think, behind the Fed now? Is this, you mentioned how long it took to get this report. Is this sort of ancient history and the Fed's moved on?
Well, I think it's ancient history in the sense that the Fed's changed all the rules. You can't do these things now that you could have done before. That's the same thing that I did when I was the president of the New York Fed. I basically said, this is a regime in place that allows too many things that could potentially happen that could create the appearance of conflict. Let's just tighten this up a lot so there's no question. There's no question, there's no risk. And I think that's what the Federal Reserve has done. So I don't think there's much risk of anything happening in the future. But, it would have been nice if you had tightened up the regime before this happened rather than after.
All right, we're going to pivot a little bit because the reason we really initially wanted to talk to you was about what the Fed does next. And we're looking at the markets where we had another record on the S&P 500. Investors continuing to embrace maybe this risk on trade on expectations, Bill, that we're going to have a pretty aggressive Fed. And they're pricing in, or it seems to be pricing in, a fair amount of Fed rate cuts this year. What are you seeing when you look at the markets? And what do you think Fed officials are thinking and seeing when they see the move up, especially on the equity side of things?
Well, I think the reason why the markets are doing well is because the probability of a soft landing has gone up. I mean, what's basically happened is the economy's continued to grow, and that's kept the labor market tight. But the tightness of the labor market is not leading to acceleration in wage inflation or an increase in ongoing prices for goods and services. So it's sort of like the best of all worlds. So we had we brought inflation down without much.
Are you saying Goldilocks? Are you saying definitely a soft landing here?
So no, not at all. So far, so good. So I don't think the story has been fully written yet, and we'll have to see where we go. I mean, it's very difficult for the Fed to generate a soft landing because you basically need growth weak enough to keep the economy from overheating, but strong enough to keep the economy out of recession. And that margin for error right now is very, very small. So I think it's really too soon to conclude that we're on this golden path. But the chances of a soft landing definitely have gone up, and that's what the market's reacting to.
A month
I think
ago,
what we're in for.
Sorry, Bill. A month ago, you wrote a column for Bloomberg Opinion that said that the pivot is a pretty big gamble and that there's a significant chance there won't be a soft landing. Would you say there's still a significant chance? Or if not, what data has come in to show you that there is a better chance of a soft landing?
Well, I think there's risk on both sides. Number one, monetary policy might not be as tight as the Fed thinks it is. And if that's the case, the economy keeps growing, the labor market stays tight, and we don't get inflation all the way back to 2%. And so the Fed Reserve, that's sort of the no landing scenario. The other scenario, of course, is that the Fed keeps monetary policy a little too tight for too long. The labor market deteriorates, and once the labor market starts to deteriorate, that usually tends to be fairly sizable rather than small. The SOM rule says every time the unemployment rate goes up by more than 0.5%, you have a full-blown recession. So, the Fed is trying to find the exactly right guide path. And, when Powell, does this press conference next week, everyone's going to ask him questions about what are you going to do in March, what are you going to do in May? And the answer is they don't know at this point because the economic information is going to tell them whether they're on the right glide path or not. If the economy is weaker than expected, the labor market has more slack than expected, then the Federal Reserve will cut rates sooner and by more. If the economy is stronger than expected and inflation stays a little bit higher than expected, then the Federal Reserve will keep monetary policy on hold. And relatively small differences in the growth trajectory right now are going to have pretty big implications for the interest rate path. That's why the market's very volatile. It's reacting to each piece of incoming information because each piece of incoming information affects the probability of these three different outcomes.
Bill, we're talking a lot about politics these days with the primaries and caucuses underway. And I'm wondering, question I know the answer to, your basic answer to. If I ask you, will politics of this election year play into Fed decision-making, you're going to tell me no, the Fed doesn't let that happen. But we know from the transcripts that it gets talked about. And given the fact that one of the candidates has said a lot of nasty things about the Federal Reserve, would the Fed prefer, if it knows it's going to be cutting interest rates, to do it before the September meeting to sort of stay out of the headlines of politics?
I think at the end of the day, the Federal Reserve will set monetary policy on what they think is the right formula to generate the best possible combination of full employment and price stability. The Fed can't pay attention to politics because if they start to pay attention to politics, that politicizes the Fed and makes the Fed vulnerable to attack. This is why Chair Powell, when he's asked about fiscal policy, tax cuts, and things of that sort, he never wants to talk about any of those things because he doesn't want the Fed involved in the political debate. And so I think the Fed will stay very apolitical. My own experience, I was at the Federal Reserve for 11 and a half years around the FOMC table. Never did politics come up as a reason to adjust monetary policy either more slowly or more quickly.
But Bill, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, did you ever feel any sort of internal pressure as a human being, thinking about what your decision might mean in the context of how voters react?
I think at the end of the day, you just have to be, blind to that. I mean, I think the only way it might come up is there have been cases in the past where the election's been right after an FOMC meeting. So maybe that FOMC meeting that's a couple days before the election, maybe that's one that you take a pass on. But that only occurs every once in a while because a lot of times the meeting happens after the election. The election's the first Tuesday in November, and the Fed has an FOMC meeting around that time. And where that FOMC meeting falls could maybe have a very, 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 very marginal effect. But I think beyond that, I think there's just nothing there because if the Fed starts going down this path, where does it end? Then the Fed gets accused of being political. Then people start to talk about, maybe we need to rein in the Fed's independence. Fed loses independence, then it loses its ability to conduct monetary policy in a way best designed to achieve its dual mandate objectives. So it's a slippery slope. You don't want to start going down that slippery slope.
But safe to say, Donald Trump, if he is, and everything is pointing to him being the Republican presidential candidate again, if he, he's not been shy about his feelings, certainly, about the Fed and Jay Powell specifically. Should Jay Powell and Fed officials worry, though, possibly about becoming part of the campaign, whether they like it or not?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me at all if, the candidate Trump started to, attack the Fed for cutting interest rates, arguing that was somehow aiding the Biden, reelection chances. So that certainly could come up. I mean, that wouldn't surprise me at all. But the Fed Reserve would be, no, we're doing what we think is appropriate to achieve our dual mandate objectives.
All right, so your best bet, and we totally get it, data dependent. We're going to move from data point to data point. Having said that, are investors' markets not being smart in not including in their thinking that the Fed could actually raise rates again, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think the likelihood of the Fed raising rates from here is very low, and I think the reason is that Fed already thinks monetary policy is quite restrictive. So they would have to be convinced that monetary policy is not restrictive. I think if it turns out that the economy is stronger than expected, inflation's higher than expected, it's more likely they just stay at the current level for longer, as opposed to move to actually start to hike rates again. I think the bar to raising rates at this point is pretty high.
Why does it seem to you that the dot plot kind of shows that Fed officials are all over the place over the next couple of years? What kind of uncertainty does that suggest? Does it suggest that there are real camps of doves and hawks?
I think that this is just a very uncertain outlook. I mean, how many times have we had recoveries from pandemics and the economy having lots of inflation, with the Federal Reserve being very slow to tighten monetary policy? And so that's sort of the bad news. And then the good news, it seems like it's working out pretty well so far. So the Fed has caught up, economy has slowed a bit, inflation's come down. So I think, the reason why, it's just a very tricky environment. I think that, Fed officials probably disagree mostly about the economic outlook, the uncertainties about the economic outlook.